Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. So today we're reading Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, picking off from where we left off last. And I believe we are on chapter 15. Alright, so we got chapter 15, Beauxbaton and Durmstrang. Early next morning, Harry woke with a plan fully formed in his mind, as though his sleeping brain had been working on it all night. He got up, dressed in the pale dawnlight, left the dormitory without waking Ron, and went back down to the deserted common room. Here he took a piece of parchment from the table upon which his divination homework still lay, and wrote the following letter. Dear Sirius, I reckon I just imagined my scar hurting. I was half asleep when I wrote to you last time. There's no point coming back. Everything's fine here. Don't worry about me. My head feels completely normal. Harry. He then climbed out of the portrait hole, up through the silent castle, held up only briefly by Peeves, who tried to overturn a large vase on him halfway along the fourth floor corridor, finally arriving at the Owlery, which was situated at the top of West Tower. The Owlery was a circular stone room, rather cold and drafty, because none of the windows had glass in them. The floor was entirely covered in straw, owl droppings, and the regurgitated skeletons of mice and owls. Hundreds upon hundreds of owls of every breed imaginable were nestled here on perches that rose right up to the top of the tower, nearly all of them asleep, though here and there a round amber eye glared at him. He spotted Hedwig nestled between a barn owl and a tawny, and hurried over to her, sliding a little on the dropping-strewn floor. It took a while to persuade her to wake up, and then to look at him, as he kept shuffling around on her perch, showing him her tail. She was evidently still furious about his lack of gratitude the previous night. In the end, it was Harry suggesting she might be too tired, and that perhaps he would ask Ron to borrow Pidgewaggin. That made her stick out her leg and allow him to tie the letter to it. Just find him, all right? Harry said, stroking her back as he carried her on his arm to one of the holes in the wall, before the Dementors do. She nipped his finger, perhaps rather harder than she would ordinarily have done, but hooted softly in a reassuring sort of way all the same. Then she spread her wings and took off into the sunrise. Harry watched her fly out of sight with the familiar feeling of unease back in his stomach. He had been so sure that Sirius's reply would alleviate his worries rather than increasing them. That was a lie, Harry, said Hermione sharply over breakfast, when he told her and Ron what he had done. You didn't imagine your scar hurting, and you know it. So what, said Harry. He's not going back to Azkaban because of me. Drop it, said Ron sharply to Hermione as she opened her mouth to argue some more, and for once Hermione heeded him and fell silent. Harry did his best not to worry about Sirius over the next couple of weeks. True, he could not stop himself from looking anxiously around every morning when the post owls arrived, nor late at night before he went to sleep, prevent himself from seeing horrible visions of Sirius, cornered by Dementors down some dark London street. But between times he tried to keep his mind off his godfather. He wished he still had Quidditch to distract him. Nothing worked so well on a troubled mind as a good, hard training session. On the other hand, their lessons were becoming more difficult and demanding than ever before, particularly Moody's defense against the dark arts. To their surprise, Professor Moody had announced that he would be putting the Imperious Curse on each of them in turn to demonstrate its power and to see whether they could resist its effects. But you said it's illegal, Professor, said Hermione uncertainly as Moody cleared away the desks with a sweep of his wand, leaving a large clear space in the middle of the room. You said to use it against another human was. Dumbledore wants you taught what it feels like, said Moody, his magical eye swiveling onto Hermione and fixing her with an eerie, unblinking stare. If you'd rather learn the hard way, when someone's putting it on you, so they can control you completely, fine by me. You're excused. Off you go. He pointed one gnarled finger toward the door. Hermione went very pink and muttered something about not meaning that she wanted to leave. Harry and Ron grinned at each other. They knew Hermione would rather eat Bubbletubberpuss than miss such an important lesson. Moody began to beckon students forward in turn and put the Imperious Curse upon them. Harry watched as one by one his classmates did the most extraordinary things under its influence. Dean Thomas hopped 3 times around the room singing the national anthem. Lavender Brown imitated a squirrel. Neville performed a series of quite astonishing gymnastics he would certainly not have been capable of in his normal state. Not one of them seemed to be able to fight off the curse, and each of them recovered only when Moody had removed it. Potter, Moody growled, you next. Harry moved forward into the middle of the classroom, into the space that Moody had cleared of desks. Moody raised his wand, pointed at Harry, and said Imperio. It was the most wonderful feeling. Harry felt a floating sensation as every thought and worry in his head was wiped gently away, leaving nothing but a vague, untraceable happiness. He stood there feeling immensely relaxed, only dimly aware of everyone watching him. And then he heard Mad-Eye Moody's voice echoing in some distant chamber of his empty brain, "Jump onto the desk. Jump onto the desk." Harry bent his knees obediently, preparing to spring. Jump onto the desk. Why, though? Another voice had awoken in the back of his brain. "Stupid thing to do, really," said the voice. "Jump onto the desk." "No, I don't think I will." "Thanks," said the other voice a little more firmly. "No, I don't really want to. Jump now." The next thing Harry felt was considerable pain. He had both jumped and tried to prevent himself from jumping. The result was that he'd smashed headlong into the desk, knocking it over, and by the feeling in his legs, fractured both his kneecaps. "Now that's more like it," growled Moody's voice, and suddenly Harry felt the empty, echoing feeling in his head disappear. He remembered exactly what was happening, and the pain in his knees seemed to double. "Look at that, you lot. Potter fought. He fought it, and he damn near beat it. We'll try that again, Potter, and the rest of you pay attention. Watch his eyes. That's where you see it. Very good, Potter. Very good indeed. They'll have trouble controlling you." "The way he talks," Harry muttered as he hobbled out of Defense Against the Dark Arts class an hour later. Moody had insisted on putting Harry through his paces 4 times in a row until Harry could throw off the curse entirely. "You'd think we were all going to be attacked any second." "Yeah, I know," said Ron, who was skipping on every alternate step. He had had much more difficulty with the curse than Harry, though Moody assured him the effects would wear off by lunchtime. Talk about paranoid! Ron glanced nervously over his shoulder to check that Moody was definitely out of earshot and went on. "No wonder they were glad to get shot of him at the ministry. Did you hear him telling Seamus what he did to that witch who shouted boo behind him on April Fool's Day? And when are we supposed to read up on resisting the Imperious Curse with everything else we've got to do?" All the fourth years had noticed a definite increase in the amount of work they were required to do this term. Professor McGonagall explained why when the class gave a particularly loud groan at the amount of Transfiguration homework she had assigned. "You are now entering a most important phase of your magical education," she told them, her eyes glinting dangerously behind her square spectacles. "Your ordinary wizarding levels are drawing closer." "We don't take OWLs till 5th year," said Dean Thomas indignantly. "Maybe not, Thomas, but believe me, you need all the preparation you can get. Miss Granger remains the only person in this class who has managed to turn a hedgehog into a satisfactory pincushion. I might remind you that your pincushion, Thomas, still curls up in fright if anyone approaches it with a pin." Hermione, who had turned rather pink again, seemed to be trying not to look too pleased with herself. Harry and Ron were deeply amused when Professor Trelawney told them that they had received top marks for their homework in their next divination class. She read out large portions of their predictions, commending them for their unflinching acceptance of the horrors in store for them. But they were less amused when she asked them to do the same thing for the month after next. Both of them were running out of ideas for catastrophes. Meanwhile, Professor Binns, the ghost who taught history of magic, had them writing weekly essays on the goblin rebellions of the 18th century. Professor Snape was forcing them to research antidotes. They took this one seriously, as he had hinted that he might be poisoning one of them before Christmas to see if their antidote worked. Professor Flitwick had asked them to read their extra books in preparation for their lesson on summoning charms. Geez, 3 extra books, man. Even Hagrid was adding to their workload. The Blasted Scroots were growing at a remarkable pace, given that nobody had yet discovered what they ate. Hagrid was delighted, and as part of their project, suggested that they come down to his hut on alternate evenings to observe the Scroots and make notes on their extraordinary behavior. "I will not," said Draco Malfoy flatly when Hagrid had proposed this with the air of Father Christmas pulling an extra-large toy out of his sack. "I see enough of these foul things during lessons. Thanks." Hagrid's smile faded off his face. "You'll do what you're told," he growled, "or I'll be taking a leaf out of Professor Moody's book. I hear you made a good ferret, Malfoy." The Gryffindors roared with laughter. Malfoy flushed with anger, but apparently the memory of Moody's punishment was still sufficiently painful to stop him from retorting. Harry, Ron, and Hermione returned to the castle at the end of the lesson in high spirits. Seeing Hagrid put down Malfoy was particularly satisfying, especially because Malfoy had done his very best to get Hagrid sacked the previous year. When they arrived in the entrance hall, they found themselves unable to proceed, owing to the large crowd of students congregated there, all kneeling around a large sign that had been erected at the foot of the marble staircase. Ron, the tallest of the 3, stood on tiptoe to see over the heads in front of them and read the sign aloud to the other 2. "Triwizard Tournament. The delegations from Bobaton and Durmstrang will arrive at 6 o'clock on Friday the 30th of October. Lessons will end half an hour early." "Brilliant," said Harry. "It's potions last thing on Friday. Snape won't have time to poison us all." Students will return their bags and books to their dormitories and assemble in front of the castle to greet our guests before the welcoming feast. Only a week away, said Ernie Macmillan of Hufflepuff, emerging from the crowd, his eyes gleaming. I wonder if Cedric knows. Think I'll go and tell him. Cedric, said Ron blankly as Ernie hurried off. Diggory, said Harry. He must be entering the tournament. That idiot. Hogwarts champion, said Ron as they pushed their way through the chattering crowd toward the staircase. He's not an idiot. You just don't like him because he beat Gryffindor at Quidditch, said Hermione. I've heard he's a really good student, and he's a prefect. She spoke as though this settled the matter. You only like him because he's handsome, said Ron scathingly. Excuse me, I don't like people just because they're handsome, said Hermione indignantly. Ron gave a loud false cough, which sounded oddly like Lockhart. The appearance of the sign in the entrance hall had a marked effect upon the inhabitants of the castle. During the following week, there seemed to be only one topic of conversation, no matter where Harry went: the Triwizard Tournament. Rumors were flying from student to student like highly contagious germs. Who was going to try for Hogwarts champion? What the tournament would involve? How the students from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang differed from themselves. Harry noticed, too, that the castle seemed to be undergoing an extra thorough cleaning. Several Grammy portraits had been scrubbed, much to the displeasure of their subjects, who sat huddled in their frames, muttering darkly and wincing as they felt their raw pink faces. The suits of armor were suddenly gleaming and moving without squeaking, and Argus Filch, the caretaker, was behaving so ferociously to any students who forgot to wipe their shoes that he terrified a pair of first-year girls into hysterics. Other members of the staff seemed oddly tense, too. Longbottom, kindly do not reveal that you can't even perform a simple switching spell in front of anyone from Durmstrang. Professor McGonagall barked at the end of one particularly difficult lesson, during which Neville had accidentally transplanted his own ears onto a cactus. When they went down to breakfast on the morning of the 30th of October, they found that the Great Hall had been decorated overnight. Enormous silk banners hung from the walls, each of them representing a Hogwarts house: red with a gold lion for Gryffindor, blue with a bronze eagle for Ravenclaw, yellow with a black badger for Hufflepuff, and green with a silver serpent for Slytherin. Behind the teachers' tables, the largest banner of all bore the Hogwarts coat of arms: lion, eagle, badger, and snake united around a large letter H. Here's the crazy thing. As Ravenclaw, you would think would be represented with a raven. Instead, it's represented with an eagle. So therefore, wouldn't it be called Eagle Claw instead of Ravenclaw? There's food for thought. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat down beside Fred and George at the Gryffindor table. Once again, and most unusually, they were sitting apart from everyone else and conversing in low voices. Ron led the way over to them. It's a bummer, all right, George was saying gloomily to Fred, but if he won't talk to us in person, we'll have to send him the letter after all, or we'll stuff it into his hand. He can't avoid us forever. Who's avoiding you? Said Ron, sitting down next to them. Wish you would, said Fred, looking irritated at the interruption. What's a bummer? Ron asked George. Having a nosy git like you for brother, said George. You two got any ideas on the Triwizard Tournament yet? Harry asked. Thought any more about trying to enter? I asked McGonagall how the champions are chosen. But she wasn't telling, said George bitterly. She just told me to shut up and get on with transfiguring my raccoon. Wonder what the tasks are going to be, said Ron thoughtfully. You know, I bet we could do them, Harry. We've done dangerous stuff before. Not in front of a panel of judges, you haven't, said Fred. McGonagall says the champions get awarded points according to how well they've done the tasks. Who are the judges? Harry asked. Well, the heads of the participating schools are always on the panel, said Hermione, and everyone looked around at her, rather surprised, because all three of them were injured during the tournament of 1792, when a cockatrice the champions were supposed to be catching went on the rampage. She noticed them all looking at her and said with the usual air of impatience that nobody else had read all the books she had. It's all in Hogwarts a History, though of course that book's not entirely reliable. A revised history of Hogwarts would be a more accurate title, or a highly biased and selective history of Hogwarts, which glosses over the nastier aspects of the school. What are you on about? Said Ron, though Harry thought he knew what was coming. House elves, said Hermione, her eyes flashing. Not once in over 1,000 pages does Hogwarts a History mention that we are all colluded in the oppression of 100 slaves. Harry shook his head and applied himself to his scrambled eggs. His and Ron's lack of enthusiasm had done nothing whatsoever to curb Hermione's determination to pursue justice for house elves. True, both of them had paid 2 sickles for an SPEW badge, but they had only done it to keep her quiet. Their sickles had been wasted, however, if anything. They seemed to have made Hermione more ferocious. She had been badgering Harry and Ron ever since, first to wear the badges, then to persuade others to do the same, and she had also taken to rattling around the Gryffindor common room every evening, cornering people and shaking the collecting tin under their noses. You do realize that your sheets are changed, your fires lit, your classrooms cleaned, and your food cooked by a group of magical creatures who are unpaid and enslaved, she kept saying fiercely. Some people, like Neville, had paid up just to stop Hermione from glowering at them. A few seemed mildly interested in what she had to say, but were reluctant to take a more active role in campaigning. Many regarded the whole thing as a joke. Ron now rolled his eyes at the ceiling, them in which was flooding them all in autumn sunlight, and Fred became extremely interested in his bacon. Both twins had refused to buy a SPEW badge. George, however, leaned in toward Hermione. Listen, have you ever been down in the kitchens, Hermione? No, of course not, said Hermione curtly. I hardly think students are supposed to. Well, we have, said George, indicating Fred, loads of times to nick food, and we've met them. And they're happy. They think they've got the best job in the world. That's because they're uneducated and brainwashed. Hermione began hotly, but her next few words were drowned out by the sudden whooshing noise from overhead, which announced the arrival of the post owls. Hold on, guys. Alright, guys, sorry, I had to take that for a second. Alright, Harry looked up at once and saw Hedwig soaring toward him. Hermione stopped talking abruptly. She and Ron watched Hedwig anxiously as she fluttered down onto Harry's shoulder, folded her wings, and held out her leg wearily. Harry pulled off Sirius's reply and offered Hedwig his bacon rinds, which she ate gratefully. Then, checking that Fred and George were safely immersed in further discussions about the Triwizard Tournament, Harry read out Sirius's letter in a whisper to Ron and Hermione. Nice try, Harry. I'm back in the country and well hidden. I want you to keep me posted on everything that's going on in Hogwarts. Don't use Hedwig. Keep changing owls. And don't worry about me. Just watch out for yourself. Don't forget what I said about your scar. Sirius. Why do you have to keep changing owls? Ron asked in a low voice. Hedwig will attract too much attention, said Hermione at once. She stands out. A snowy owl that keeps returning to wherever he's hiding. I mean, they're not native birds, are they? Harry rolled up the letter and slipped it inside his robes, wondering whether he felt more or less worried than before. He supposed that Sirius managing to get back without being caught was something. He couldn't deny either that the idea that Sirius was much nearer was reassuring. At least he wouldn't have to wait so long for a response every time he wrote. Thanks, Hedwig, he said, stroking her. She hooted sleepily, dipped her head dipped her beak briefly into his goblet of orange juice, then took off again, clearly desperate for a good long sleep in the owlery. There was a pleasant feeling of anticipation in the air that day. Nobody was very attentive in lessons, being much more interested in the arrival that evening of the people from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang. Even potions was more bearable than usual, as it was half an hour shorter. When the bell rang early, Harry, Ron, and Hermione hurried up to Gryffindor Tower, deposited their bags and books as they had been instructed, pulled on their cloaks, and rushed back downstairs into the entrance hall. The heads of houses were ordering their students into lines. Weasley, straighten your hat. Professor McGonagall snapped at Ron. Miss Patel, take that ridiculous thing out of your hair. Pavarti scowled and removed a large ornamental butterfly from the end of her plait. Follow me, please, said Professor McGonagall. First years in front, no pushing. They filed down the steps and lined up in front of the castle. It was a cold, clear evening. Dusk was falling, and a pale, transparent-looking moon was already shining over the forbidden forest. Harry, standing between Ron and Hermione in the fourth row from the front, saw Dennis Creevy positively shivering with anticipation among the other first years. "Nearly 6," said Ron, checking his watch and then staring down the drive that led to the front gates. "How do you reckon they're coming? The train?" "I doubt it," said Hermione. "How then? Broomsticks?" Harry suggested, looking up at the starry sky. "I don't think so. Not from that far away." "A port key," Ron suggested, "or they could apparate. Maybe you're allowed to do it under 17, wherever they come from." "You can't apparate inside the Hogwarts grounds. How often do I have to tell you?" said Hermione impatiently. They scanned the darkening grounds excitedly, but nothing was moving. Everything was still, silent, and quite as usual. Harry was starting to feel cold. He wished they'd hurry up. Maybe the foreign students were preparing a dramatic entrance. He remembered what Mr. Weasley had said back at the campsite before the Quidditch World Cup. Always the same. We can't resist showing off when we get together. And then Dumbledore called out from the back row where he stood with the other teachers. "Aha! Unless I am very much mistaken, the delegation from Beauxbaton approaches." "Where?" said many students eagerly, all looking in different directions. "There," yelled the sixth year, pointing over the forest. Something large, much larger than a broomstick, or indeed 100 broomsticks, was hurtling across the deep blue sky toward the castle, growing larger all the time. "It's a dragon!" shrieked one of the first years, losing her head completely. "Don't be stupid, it's a flying house," said Dennis Creevy. Dennis's guess was closer, as a gigantic black shape skimmed over the treetops of the Forbidden Forest, and the lights shining from the castle windows hid it. They saw a gigantic, powder-blue, horse-drawn carriage the size of a large house soaring toward them, pulled through the air by a dozen winged horses, all palominos and each the size of an elephant. The front 3 rows of students drew backward as the carriage hurtled even lower, coming in to land at a tremendous speed. Then, with an almighty crash that made Neville jump backward onto a Slytherin fifth year's foot, the horse's hooves, larger than dinner plates, hit the ground. A second later, the carriage landed too, bouncing upon its vast wheels, while the golden horses tossed their enormous heads and rolled large, fiery red eyes. Harry just had time to see that the door of the carriage bore a coat of arms, 2 crossed golden wands, each emitting 3 stars, before it opened. A boy in pale blue robes jumped down from the carriage, bent forward, fumbled for a moment with something on the carriage floor, and unfolded a set of golden steps. He sprang back respectfully. Then Harry saw a shining, high-heeled black shoe emerging from the inside of the carriage, a shoe the size of a child's sled, followed, almost immediately, by the largest woman he had ever seen in his life. The size of the carriage and of the horses was immediately explained. A few people gasped. Harry had only ever seen one person as large as this woman in his life, and that was Hagrid. He doubted whether there was an inch difference in their heights. Yet somehow, maybe simply because he was used to Hagrid, this woman, now at the foot of the steps and looking around at the waiting, wide-eyed crowd, seemed even more unnaturally large. As she stepped into the light flooding from the entrance hall, she was revealed to have a handsome, olive-skinned face, large, black, liquid-looking eyes, and a rather beaky nose. Her hair was drawn back in a shiny knob at the base of her neck. She was dressed from head to foot in black satin, and many magnificent opals gleamed at her throat and on her thick fingers. Dumbledore started to clap. The students, following his lead, broke into applause too, many of them standing on tiptoe, the better to look at this woman. Her face relaxed into a gracious smile, and she walked forward toward Dumbledore, extending a glittering hand. Dumbledore, though tall himself, had barely to bend to kiss it. "My dear Madame Maxim," he said, "welcome to Hogwarts." "Dumbledore," said Madame Maxim in a deep voice, "I hope I find you well." "In excellent form, I thank you," said Dumbledore. "My pupils," said Madame Maxim, waving one of her enormous hands carelessly behind her. Harry, whose attention had been focused completely upon Madame Maxim, now noticed that about a dozen boys and girls, all, by the look of them, in their late teens, had emerged from the carriage and were now standing behind Madame Maxim. They were shivering, which was unsurprising, given that their robes seemed to be made of fine silk, and none of them were wearing cloaks. A few had wrapped scarves and shawls around their heads. From what Harry could see of them, they were standing in Madame Maxim's enormous shadow. They were staring up at Hogwarts with apprehensive looks on their faces. "Has Karkaroff arrived yet?" Madame Maxim asked. "He should be here any moment," said Dumbledore. "Would you like to wait here and greet him, or would you prefer to step inside and warm up a trifle?" "Warm up, I think," said Madame Maxim. "But the horses, our Care of Magical Creatures teacher will be delighted to take care of them," said Dumbledore, "the moment he has returned from dealing with a slight situation that has arisen with some of his other, charges." "Scroots," Ron muttered to Harry, grinning. "My steeds require forceful handling," said Madame Maxim, looking as though she doubted whether any Care of Magical Creatures teacher at Hogwarts could be up to the job. "They are very strong. I assure you that Hagrid will be well up to the job, said Dumbledore, smiling. Very well, said Madame Maxim, bowing slightly. Will you please inform Zis Agrid that the horses drink only single malt whiskey? It will be attended to, said Dumbledore, also bowing. Come, said Madame Maxim imperiously to her students, and the Hogwarts crowd parted to allow her and her students to pass up the stone steps. How the hell do you have horses that only drink single malt whiskey? What kind of creature is that? That ain't normal. That is definitely not normal. Okay. Come, said Madame Maxim imperiously to her students, and the Hogwarts crowd parted to allow her and her students to pass up the stone steps. How big do you reckon Durmstrang's horses are going to be? Seamus Finnegan said, leaning around Lavender and Parvati to address Harry and Ron. Well, if they're any bigger than this lot, even Hagrid won't be able to handle them, said Harry. That's if he hasn't been attacked by his Scroots. Wonder what's up with them. Maybe they've escaped, said Ron hopefully. Oh, don't say that, said Hermione with a shudder. Imagine that lot loose on the grounds. They stood shivering slightly now, waiting for the Durmstrang party to arrive. Most people were gazing hopefully up at the sky. For a few moments the silence was broken only by Madame Maxim's huge horses snorting and stamping. But then, can you hear something? Said Ron suddenly. Harry listened. A loud and oddly eerie noise was drifting toward them from out of the darkness, a muffled rumbling and sucking sound, as though an immense vacuum cleaner were moving along a riverbed. The lake, yelled Lee Jordan, pointing down at it. Look at the lake. From their position at the top of the lawns overlooking the grounds, they had a clear view of the smooth, black surface of the water, except that the surface was suddenly not smooth at all. Some disturbance was taking place deep in the center. Great bubbles were forming on the surface. Waves were now washing over the muddy banks, and then, out in the very middle of the lake, a whirlpool appeared, as if a giant plug had just been pulled out of the lake's floor. What seemed to be a long, black pole began to rise slowly out of the heart of the whirlpool, and then Harry saw the rigging. It's a mast, he said to Ron and Hermione. Slowly, magnificently, the ship rose out of the water, gleaming in the moonlight. It had a strangely skeletal look about it, as though it were a resurrected wreck, and the dim, misty lights shimmering at its portholes looked like ghostly eyes. Finally, with the great sloshing noise, the ship emerged entirely, bobbing on the turbulent water, and began to glide toward the bank. A few moments later, they heard the splash of an anchor being thrown down in the shallows, and the thud of a plank being lowered onto the bank. People were disembarking. They could see their silhouettes passing the lights in the ship's portholes. All of them, Harry noticed, seemed to be built along the lines of Crabbe and Goyle. But then, as they drew nearer, walking up the lawns into the light streaming from the entrance hall, he saw that their bulk was really due to the fact that they were wearing cloaks of some kind of shaggy, matted fur. But the man who was leading them up to the castle was wearing furs of a different sort, sleek and silver like his hair. Dumbledore, he called heartily as he walked up the slope. How are you, my dear fellow? How are you? Blooming, thank you, Professor Karkaroff, Dumbledore replied. Karkaroff had a fruity, unctuous voice, which he stepped into the light pouring from the front doors of the castle. They saw that he was tall and thin like Dumbledore, but his white hair was short, and his goatee, finishing in a small curl, did not entirely hide his rather weak chin. When he reached Dumbledore, he shook hands with both of his own. Dear old Hogwarts, he said, looking up at the school and smiling. His teeth were rather yellow, and Harry noticed that his smile did not extend to his eyes, which remained cold and shrewd. How good is it to be here? How good. Victor, come along into the warmth. You don't mind, Dumbledore. Victor has a slight head cold. Karkaroff beckoned forward one of his students. As the boy passed, Harry caught a glimpse of a prominent curved nose and thick black eyebrows. He didn't need the punch on the arm Ron gave him, or the hiss in his ear, to recognize that profile. Harry, it's Krum. Chapter 16, The Goblet of Fire. I don't believe it, Ron said in a stunned voice as the Hogwarts students filed back up the steps behind the party from Durmstrang. Krum, Harry. Victor Krum. For heaven's sake, Ron, he's only a Quidditch player, said Hermione. Only a Quidditch player, Ron said, looking at her as though he couldn't believe his ears. Hermione, he's one of the best seekers in the world. I had no idea he was still at school. As they crossed the entrance hall with the rest of the Hogwarts students heading for the Great Hall, Harry saw Lee Jordan jumping up and down on the soles of his feet to get a better look at the back of Krum's head. Several sixth-year girls were frantically searching their pockets as they walked. Oh, I don't believe it. I haven't got a single quill on me. Do you think he'd sign my hat and lipstick? Really? Hermione said loftily as they passed the girls, now squabbling over the lipstick. I'm getting his autograph if I can, said Ron. You haven't got a quill, have you, Harry? Nope, they're upstairs in my bag, said Harry. They walked over to the Gryffindor table and sat down. Ron took care to sit on the side facing the doorway because Krum and his fellow Durmstrang students were still gathered around it, apparently unsure about where they should sit. The students from Beauxbaton had chosen seats at the Ravenclaw table. They were looking around the great hall with glum expressions on their faces, 3 of them still clutching scarves and shawls around their heads. It's not that cold, said Hermione defensively. Why didn't they bring cloaks? Over here. Come and sit over here, Ron hissed. Over here. Hermione, budge up. Make a space. What? Too late, said Ron bitterly. Victor Krum and his fellow Durmstrang students had settled themselves at the Slytherin table. Harry could see Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle looking very smug about this as he watched Malfoy bent forward to speak to Krum. Yeah, that's right. Smarm up to him, Malfoy, said Ron scathingly. I bet Krum can see right through him, though. Bet he gets people fawning over him all the time. Where do you reckon they're going to sleep? We could offer him a space in our dormitory. Harry, I wouldn't mind giving him my bed. I could kip on a camp bed. Hermione snorted. They look a lot happier than the Beauxbaton lot, said Harry. The Durmstrang students were pulling off their heavy furs and looking up at the starry black ceiling with expressions of interest. A couple of them were picking up the golden plates and goblets and examining them, apparently impressed. Up at the staff table, Filch the caretaker was adding chairs. He was wearing his moldy old tailcoat in honor of the occasion. Harry was surprised to see that he added 4 chairs, 2 on either side of Dumbledore's. But there are only 2 extra people, said Harry. Why is Filch putting out 4 chairs? Who else is coming? Said Ron vaguely. He was still staring avidly at Krum. When all the students had entered the hall and settled down at their house tables, the staff entered, filing up to the top table and taking their seats. Last in line were Professor Dumbledore, Professor Karkaroff, and Madame Maxim. When their headmistress appeared, the pupils from Beauxbaton leapt to their feet. A few of the Hogwarts students laughed. The Beauxbatons' party appeared quite unembarrassed, however, and did not resume their seats until Madame Maxim had sat down on Dumbledore's left-hand side. Dumbledore remained standing, and a silence fell over the great hall. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, ghosts, and most particularly guests, said Dumbledore, beaming around at the foreign students. I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to Hogwarts. I hope and trust that your stay here will be both comfortable and enjoyable. One of the Beauxbaton girls, still clutching a muffler around her head, gave what was unmistakably a derisive laugh. No one's making you stay, Hermione whispered, bristling at her. The tournament will be officially open at the end of the feast, said Dumbledore. I now invite you all to eat, drink, and make yourselves at home. He sat down, and Harry saw Karkaroff lean forward at once and engage him in conversation. The plates in front of them filled with food as usual. The house elves in the kitchen seemed to have pulled out all the stops. There was a greater variety of dishes in front of them than Harry had ever seen, including several that were definitely foreign. What's that? Said Ron, pointing at a large dish of some sort of shellfish stew that stood beside a large steak and kidney pudding. Oh boy. Bouillabaisse? I think is how you say it. I could be wrong though. Leave a comment if you know how to say it. Alright, bouillabaisse, said Hermione. Bless you, said Ron. It's French, said Hermione. I had it on holiday summer before last. It's very nice. I'll take your word for it, said Ron, helping himself to black pudding. The great hall seemed somehow much more crowded than usual, even though there were barely 20 additional students there. Perhaps it was because their differently colored uniforms stood out so clearly against the black of the Hogwarts robes. Now that they had removed their furs, the Durmstrang students were revealed to be wearing robes of deep blood red. Hagrid sidled into the hall through a door behind the staff table. 20 minutes after the start of the feast, he slid into his seat at the end and waved at Harry, Ron, and Hermione with a very heavily bandaged hand. Scoot's doing all right, Hagrid, Harry called. Thriving, Hagrid called back happily. Yeah, I'll just bet they are, said Ron quietly. Looks like they finally found a food they like, doesn't it? Hagrid's fingers. At that moment, a voice said, Excuse me, are you wanting the bouillabaisse? It was the girl from Beauxbaton who had laughed during Dumbledore's speech. She had finally removed her muffler. A long sheet of silvery blonde hair fell almost to her waist. She had large, deep blue eyes and very white, even teeth. Ron went purple. He stared at her, opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out except a faint gurgling noise. Yeah, I have it, said Harry, pushing the dish toward the girl. You have finished, was it? Yeah, Ron said breathlessly. Yeah, it was excellent. The girl picked up the dish and carried it carefully off to the Ravenclaw table. Ron was still goggling at the girl as though he had never seen one before. Harry started to laugh. The sound seemed to jog Ron back to his senses. She's a Veela, he said hoarsely to Harry. "Of course she isn't," said Hermione tartly. "I don't see anyone else gaping at her like an idiot." But she wasn't entirely right about that. As the girl crossed the hall, many boys' heads turned, and some of them seemed to have become temporarily speechless, just like Ron. "I'm telling you, that's not a normal girl," said Ron, leaning sideways so he could keep a clear view of her. "They don't make them like that at Hogwarts." "They make them okay at Hogwarts," said Harry without looking. Cho happened to be sitting only a few paces away from the girl with the silvery hair. "When you've both put your eyes back in," said Hermione briskly, "you'll be able to see who's just arrived." She was pointing up the staff table. The two remaining empty seats had just been filled. Leto Bagman was now sitting on Professor Karkaroff's other side, while Mr. Crouch, Percy's boss, was next to Madame Maxim. "What are they doing here?" said Harry in surprise. "They organized the Triwizard Tournament, didn't they?" said Hermione. "I suppose they wanted to be here to see it start." When the second course arrived, they announced a number of unfamiliar desserts, too. Ron examined an odd sort of pale blancmange closely, then moved it carefully a few inches to his right so that it would be clearly visible from the Ravenclaw table. The girl who looked like Avila appeared to have eaten enough, however, and did not come over to get it. Once the golden plates had been wiped clean, Dumbledore stood up again. A pleasant sort of tension seemed to fill the hall now. Harry felt a slight thrill of excitement, wondering what was coming. Several seats down from them, Fred and George were leaning forward, staring at Dumbledore with great concentration. "The moment has come," said Dumbledore, smiling around at the sea of upturned faces. "The Triwizard Tournament is about to start. I would like to say a few words of explanation before we begin in the casket. Before we bring in the casket." "The what?" Harry muttered. Ron shrugged. "Just to clarify the procedure that we will be following this year. But first, let me introduce, for those who do not know them, Mr. Bartemius Crouch, head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation." There was a smattering of polite applause. "And Mr. Leto Bagman, head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports." There was a much louder round of applause for Bagman than for Crouch, perhaps because of his fame as a beater, or simply because he looked so much more likable. He acknowledged it with a jovial wave of his hand. Bartemius Crouch did not smile or wave when his name was announced. Remembering him in his neat suit at the Quidditch World Cup, Harry thought he looked strange in wizard's robes. His toothbrush mustache and severe parting looked very odd next to Dumbledore's long white hair and beard. "Mr. Bagman and Mr. Crouch have worked tirelessly over the last few months on the arrangements for the Triwizard Tournament," Dumbledore continued, "and they will be joining myself, Professor Karkaroff, and Madame Maxim on the panel that will judge the champions' efforts." At the mention of the word champions, the attentiveness of listening students seemed to sharpen. Perhaps Dumbledore had noticed their sudden stillness, for he smiled and, as he said, "The casket, then, if you please, Mr. Filch." Filch, who had been lurking unnoticed in a far corner of the hall, now approached Dumbledore carrying a great wooden chest encrusted with jewels. It looked extremely old. A murmur of excited interest rose from the watching students. Dennis Creevey actually stood on his chair to see it properly, but being so tiny, his head hardly rose above anyone else's. "The instructions for the tasks the champions will face this year have already been examined by Mr. Crouch and Mr. Bagman," said Dumbledore as Filch placed the chest carefully on the table before him, "and they have made the necessary arrangements for each challenge. There will be 3 tasks spaced throughout the school years, and they will test the champions in many different ways: their magical prowess, their daring, their powers of dedication, and, of course, their ability to cope with danger." At this last word, the hall was filled with a silence so absolute that nobody seemed to be breathing. "As you know, 3 champions compete in the tournament," Dumbledore went on calmly, "one from each of the participating schools. They will be marked on how well they perform each of the tournament tasks, and the champion with the highest total after Task 3 will win the Triwizard Cup. The champions will be chosen by an impartial selector, the Goblet of Fire." Dumbledore now took out his wand and tapped 3 times upon the top of the casket. The lid creaked slowly open. Dumbledore reached inside it and pulled out a large, roughly hewn wooden cup. It would have been entirely unremarkable had it not been full to the brim with dancing blue-white flames. Dumbledore closed the casket and placed the goblet carefully on top of it, where it would be clearly visible to everyone in the hall. Anybody wishing to submit themselves as a champion must write their name and school clearly upon a slip of parchment and drop it into the goblet, said Dumbledore. Aspiring champions have 24 hours in which to put their names forward. Tomorrow night, Halloween, the goblet will return the names of the 3 it has judged most worthy to represent their schools. The goblet will be placed in the entrance hall tonight, where it will be freely accessible to all those wishing to compete. To ensure that no underage student yields to temptation, said Dumbledore, I will be drawing an age line around the Goblet of Fire once it has been placed in the entrance hall. Nobody under the age of 17 will be able to cross this line. Finally, I wish to impress upon any of you wishing to compete that this tournament is not to be entered into lightly. Once a champion has been selected by the Goblet of Fire, he or she is obliged to see the tournament through to the end. The placing of your name in the goblet constitutes a binding, magical contract. There can be no change of heart once you have become a champion. Please be very sure, therefore, that you are wholeheartedly prepared to play before you drop your name into the goblet. Now I think it is time for bed. Good night to you all." "An age line," Fred Weasley said, his eyes glinting as they all made their way across the hall to the doors into the entrance hall. "Well, that should be fooled by an aging potion, shouldn't it? And once your name's in that goblet, you're laughing. It can't tell whether you're 17 or not." "But I don't think anyone under 17 will stand a chance," said Hermione. "We just haven't learned enough." "Speak for yourself," said George shortly. "You'll try and get in, won't you, Harry?" Harry thought briefly of Dumbledore's insistence that nobody under 17 should submit their name, but then the wonderful picture of himself winning the Triwizard Tournament filled his mind again. He wondered how angry Dumbledore would be if someone younger than 17 did find a way to get over the age line. "Where is he?" said Ron, who wasn't listening to a word of this conversation, but looked through the crowd to see what had happened of Krum. Dumbledore didn't say where the Durmstrang people are sleeping, did he? But this query was answered almost instantly. They were level with the Slytherin table now, and Karkaroff had just bustled up to his students. "Back to the ship, then," he was saying. "Victor, how are you feeling? Did you eat enough? Should I send for some mulled wine from the kitchens?" Harry saw Krum shake his head as he pulled his furs back on. "Professor, I would like some wine," said one of the other Durmstrang boys hopefully. "I wasn't offering it to you." "Polikoff," snapped Karkaroff, his warmly paternal air vanishing in an instant. "I noticed you have dribbled food all down the front of your robes again. Disgusting boy." Karkaroff turned and led his students toward the doors, reaching them at exactly the same moment as Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Harry stopped to let him walk through first. "Thank you," said Karkaroff, carelessly glancing at him. And then Karkaroff froze. He turned his head back to Harry and stared at him as though he couldn't believe his eyes. Behind their headmaster, the students from Durmstrang came to a halt too. Karkaroff's eyes moved slowly up Harry's face and fixed upon his scar. The Durmstrang students were staring curiously at Harry too. Out of the corner of his eye, Harry saw comprehension dawn on a few of their faces. The boy with food all down his front nudged the girl next to him and pointed openly at Harry's forehead. "Yeah, that's Harry Potter," said a growling voice from behind them. Professor Karkaroff spun around. Mad-Eye Moody was standing there, leaning heavily on his staff, his magical eye glaring unblinkingly at the Durmstrang headmaster. The color drained from Karkaroff's face as Harry watched. A terrible look of mingled fury and fear came over him. "You," he said, staring at Moody, as though unsure he was really seeing him. "Me," said Moody grimly, "and unless you've got anything to say to Potter, Karkaroff, you might want to move. You're blocking the doorway." It was true. Half the students in the hall were now waiting behind them, looking over one another's shoulders to see what was causing the holdup. Without another word, Professor Karkaroff swept his students away with him. Moody watched him until he was out of sight, his magical eye fixed upon his back, a look of intense dislike upon his mutilated face. As the next day was Saturday, most students would normally have breakfasted late. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, were not alone in rising much earlier than they usually did on weekends. When they went down into the entrance hall, they saw about 20 people milling around it, some of them eating toast, all examining the goblet of fire. It had been placed in the center of the hall on the stool that normally bore the sorting hat. A thin golden line had been traced on the floor, forming a circle 10 feet around it in every direction. "Anyone put their name in yet?" Ron asked the third-year girl eagerly. "All the Durmstrang lot," she replied, "but I haven't seen anyone from Hogwarts yet." "Bet some of them put it in last night after we'd all gone to bed," said Harry. "I would have, if it had been me. Wouldn't have wanted anyone watching. What if the goblet just gobbed you right back out again?" Someone laughed behind Harry. Turning, he saw Fred, George, and Lee Jordan hurrying down the staircase, all three of them looking extremely excited. "Done it," Fred said on a triumphant whisper to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "Just taking it." "What?" said Ron. "The aging potion, dung brains," said Fred. "1 drop each," said George, rubbing his hands together with glee. "We only need to be a few months older. We're going to split the 1,000 galleons between the 3 of us if one of us wins," said Lee, grinning broadly. "I'm not sure this is going to work, you know," said Hermione warningly. "I'm sure Dumbledore will have thought of this." Fred, George, and Lee ignored her. "Ready?" Fred said to the other two, quivering with excitement. "Come on, then. I'll go first." Harry watched, fascinated, as Fred pulled a slip of parchment out of his pocket bearing the words Fred Weasley, Hogwarts. Fred walked right up to the edge of the line and stood there, rocking on his toes like a diver preparing for a 50-foot drop. Then, with the eyes of every person in the entrance hall upon him, he took a great breath and stepped over the line. For a split second, Harry thought it had worked. George certainly thought so, for he let out a yell of triumph and leapt after Fred. But next moment there was a loud sizzling sound, and both twins were hurled out of the golden circle, as though they had been thrown by an invisible shot-putter. They landed painfully 10 feet away on the cold stone floor, and to add insult to injury, there was a loud popping noise, and both of them sprouted identical long white beards. The entrance hall rang with laughter. Even Fred and George joined in, once they had gotten to their feet and taken a good look at each other's beards. "I did warn you," said a deep, amused voice, and everyone turned to see Professor Dumbledore coming out of the great hall. He surveyed Fred and George, his eyes twinkling. "I suggest you both go up to Madame Pomfrey. She is already tending to Miss Fawcett of Ravenclaw and Mr. Summers of Hufflepuff, both of whom decided to age themselves up a little too. Though I must say, neither of their beards is anything like as fine as yours." Fred and George set off for the hospital wing, accompanied by Lee, who was howling with laughter, and Harry, Ron, and Hermione, also chortling, went in to breakfast. The decorations in the great hall had changed this morning. As it was Halloween, a cloud of live bats was fluttering around the enchanted ceiling, while hundreds of carved pumpkins leered from every corner. Harry led the way over to Dean and Seamus, who were discussing those Hogwarts students of 17 or over who might be entering. "There's a rumor going around that Warrington got up early and put his name in," Dean told Harry. "That big bloke from Slytherin who looks like a sloth." Harry, who had played Quidditch against Warrington, shook his head in disgust. "We can't have a Slytherin champion. And all the Hufflepuffs are talking about Diggory," said Seamus contemptuously, "but I wouldn't have thought he'd have wanted to risk his good looks." "Listen," said Hermione suddenly. People were cheering out in the entrance hall. They all swiveled around in their seats and saw Angelina Johnson coming into the hall, grinning in an embarrassed sort of way, a tall black girl who played chaser on the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Angelina came over to them, sat down, and said, "Well, I've done it. Just put my name in it." "You're kidding," said Ron, looking impressed. "Are you 17 then?" asked Harry. "Course she is." "Can't see a beard, can you?" said Ron. "I had my birthday last week," said Angelina. "Well, I'm glad someone from Gryffindor's entering," said Hermione. "I really hope you get it, Angelina." "Thanks, Hermione," said Angelina, smiling at her. "Yeah, better you than Pretty Boy Diggory," said Seamus, causing several Hufflepuffs passing their table to scowl heavily at him. "What are we going to do today, then?" Ron asked Harry and Hermione when they finished breakfast and were leaving the Great Hall. "We haven't been down to visit Hagrid yet," said Harry. "Okay," said Ron, "just as long as he doesn't ask us to donate a few fingers to the Scroots." A look of great excitement suddenly dawned on Hermione's face. "I've just realized I haven't asked Hagrid to join SPEW yet," she said brightly. "Wait for me, will you, while I nip upstairs and get the badges?" "What is it with her?" said Ron, exasperated, as Hermione ran away up the marble staircase. "Hey, Ron," said Harry suddenly, "it's your friend." The students from Beauxbaton were coming through the front doors from the grounds, among them the Vila girl. Those gathered around the goblet of fire stood back to let them pass, watching eagerly. Madame Maxim entered the hall behind her students and organized them into a line. One by one, the Beauxbaton students stepped across the age line and dropped their slips of parchment into the blue-white flames. As each name entered the fire, it turned brightly red and emitted sparks. "What do you reckon will happen to the ones who aren't chosen?" Ron muttered to Harry as the Vila girl dropped her parchment into the goblet of fire. "Reckon they'll go back to school or hang around to watch the tournament." "Dunno," said Harry. "Hang around, I suppose. Madame Maxim's staying to judge, isn't she?" When all the Beauxbaton students had submitted their names, Madame Maxim led them back out of the hall and out onto the grounds again. "Where are they sleeping, then?" said Ron, moving toward the front doors and staring after them. A loud rattling noise behind them announced Hermione's appearance with the box of SPEW badges. "Oh, good, hurry up," said Ron, and he jumped down the stone steps, keeping his eyes on the back of the Vila girl, who was now halfway across the lawn with Madame Maxim. As they neared Hagrid's cabin on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, the mystery of the Beauxbatons' sleeping quarters was solved. The gigantic powder blue carriage in which they had arrived had been parked 200 yards from Hagrid's front door, and the students were climbing back inside it. The elephantine flying horses that had pulled the carriage were now grazing in a makeshift paddock alongside it. Harry knocked on Hagrid's door, and Fang's booming barks answered instantly. "'Bout time," said Hagrid when he'd flung open the door. Thought you lot forgotten where I live." "We've been really busy," Hermione started to say, but then she stopped dead, looking up at Hagrid, apparently lost for words. Hagrid was wearing his best and very horrible hairy brown suit, plus a checkered yellow and orange tie. This wasn't the worst of it, though. He had evidently tried to tame his hair using large quantities of what appeared to be axle grease. It was now slicked down into two bunches. Perhaps he had tried a ponytail like Bill's, but found he had too much hair. The look didn't really suit Hagrid at all. For a moment, Hermione goggled at him, then obviously decided not to comment. She said, where are the Scroots?" "Out by the pumpkin patch," said Hagrid happily. "They're getting massive. Must be nearly 3 feet long now. Only trouble is, they've started killing each other." "Oh no, really?" said Hermione, shooting a repressive look at Ron, who, staring at Hagrid's odd hairstyle, had just opened his mouth to say something about it. "Yeah," said Hagrid sadly. "It's okay, though. I've got 'em in separate boxes now. Still got about 20. "Well, that's lucky," said Ron. Hagrid missed the sarcasm. Hagrid's cabin comprised a single room, in one corner of which was a gigantic bed covered in patchwork quilt. A similarly enormous wooden table and chairs stood in front of the fire beneath the quantity of cured hams and dead birds hanging from the ceiling. They sat down at the table while Hagrid started to make tea, and were soon immersed in yet more discussion of the Triwizard Tournament. Hagrid seemed quite as excited about it as they were. "You wait," he said, grinning. "You just wait. You're going to see some stuff you've never seen before. First task, but I'm not supposed to say." "Go on, Hagrid," said Harry. Ron and Hermione urged him, but he just shook his head, grinning. "I don't want to spoil it for you," said Hagrid, "but it's going to be spectacular, I'll tell you that. Them champions are going to have their work cut out. Never thought I'd live to see the Triwizard Tournament played again." They ended up having lunch with Hagrid, though they didn't eat much. Hagrid had made what he said was a beef casserole, but after Hermione unearthed a large talon in hers, she, Harry, and Ron rather lost their appetites. However, they enjoyed themselves trying to make Hagrid tell them what the tasks in the tournament were going to be, speculating which of the entrants were likely to be selected as champions, and wondering whether Fred and George were beardless yet. A light rain had started to fall by mid-afternoon. It was very cozy sitting by the fire, listening to the gentle patter of the drops on the window, watching Hagrid darning his socks and arguing with Hermione about house elves, for he flatly refused to join SPEW when she showed him her badges. "I'd be doing 'em an unkindness, Hermione," he said gravely, threading a massive bone needle with thick yellow yarn. "It's in their nature to look after humans. That's what they like, see? You'd be making 'em unhappy to take away their work, and insulting them if you tried to pay 'em." "But Harry set Dobby free, and he was over the moon about it," said Hermione. "And we heard he's asking for wages now." "Yeah, well, you got weirdos in every breed. I'm not saying there isn't the odd elf who'd take freedom, but you'll never persuade most of 'em to do it. No, nothing doing, Hermione." Hermione looked very cross indeed, and stuffed her box of badges back into her cloak pocket. By 5:30 it was growing dark, and Ron, Harry, and Hermione decided it was time to get back up to the castle for the Halloween feast, and more important, the announcement of the school champions. "I'll come with you," said Hagrid, putting away his darning. "Just give us a second." Hagrid got up, went across to the chest of drawers beside his bed, and began searching for something inside it. They didn't pay too much attention until a truly horrible smell reached their noses. Coughing, Ron said, "Hagrid, what's that?" Said Hagrid, turning around with a large bottle in his hand. "Don't you like it?" "Is that aftershave?" said Hermione in a slightly choked voice. You do cologne," Hagrid muttered. He was blushing. "Maybe it's a bit much," he said gruffly. "I'll go take it off. Hang on." He stumped out of the cabin, and they saw him washing himself vigorously in the water barrel outside the window. "You do cologne," said Hermione in amazement. "Hagrid, and what's with the hair and the suit?" said Harry in an undertone. "Look," said Ron, suddenly pointing out of the window. Hagrid had just straightened up and turned round. If he had been blushing before, it was nothing to what he was doing now. Getting to their feet very cautiously so that Hagrid wouldn't spot them, Harry, Ron, and Hermione peered through the window and saw that Madame Maxim and the Beauxbatons students had just emerged from the carriage, clearly about to set off for the feast too. They couldn't hear what Hagrid was saying, but he was talking to Madame Maxim with a rapt, misty-eyed expression Harry had only ever seen him wear once before, when he had been looking at the baby dragon, Norbert. "Oh, sounds like Hagrid's got himself a little crushy crush." "He's going up to the castle with her?" said Hermione indignantly. "I thought he was waiting for us." Without so much as a backward glance at his cabin, Hagrid was trudging off up the grounds with Madame Maxim, the Beauxbaton students following in their wake, jogging to keep up with their enormous strides. "He fancies her," said Ron incredulously. "Well, if they end up having children, they'll be setting a world record. Bet any baby of theirs would weigh about a ton." They let themselves out of the cabin and shut the door behind them. It was surprisingly dark outside. Drawing their cloaks more closely around themselves, they set off up the sloping lawns. "Oh, it's them, look," Hermione whispered. The Durmstrang party was walking up toward the castle from the lake. Victor Crumb was walking side by side with Karkaroff, and the other Durmstrang students were straggling along behind them. Ron watched Crumb excitedly, but Crumb did not look around as he reached the front doors, a little ahead of Hermione, Ron, and Harry, and proceeded through them. When they entered the candlelit great hall, it was almost full. The goblet of fire had been moved. It was now standing in front of Dumbledore's empty chair at the teacher's table. Fred and George, clean-shaven again, seemed to have taken their disappointment fairly well. "Hope it's Angelina," said Fred as Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat down. "So do I," said Hermione breathlessly. "Well, we'll see. We'll soon know." The Halloween feast seemed to take much longer than usual. Perhaps because it was their second feast in 2 days, Harry didn't seem to fancy the extravagantly prepared food as much as he would have normally. Like everyone else in the hall, judging by the constantly craning necks, the impatient expressions on every face, the fidgeting, and the standing up to see whether Dumbledore had finished eating yet, Harry simply wanted the plates to clear and to hear who had been selected as champions. At long last, the golden plates returned to their original spotless state. There was a sharp upswing in the level of noise within the hall, which died away almost instantly as Dumbledore got to his feet. On either side of him, Professor Karkaroff and Madame Maxim looked as tense and expectant as anyone. Little Bagman was beaming and winking at various students. Mr. Crouch, however, looked quite uninterested, almost bored. "Well, the goblet is almost ready to make its decision," said Dumbledore. "I estimate that it requires 1 more minute. Now, when the champions' names are called, I would ask them please to come up to the top of the hall, walk along the staff table, and go through into the next chamber." He indicated the door behind the staff table, where they will be receiving their first instructions. He took out his wand and gave a great sweeping wave with it. At once, all the candles except those inside the carved pumpkins were extinguished, plunging them into a state of semi-darkness. The goblet of fire now shone more brightly than anything in the whole hall, the sparkling bright bluey whiteness of the flames almost painful on the eyes. Everyone watched, waiting. A few people kept checking their watches. "Any second," Lee Jordan whispered, 2 seats away from Harry. The flames inside the goblet turned suddenly red again. Sparks began to fly from it. Next moment, a tongue of flame shot into the air. A charred piece of parchment fluttered out of it. The whole room gasped. Dumbledore caught the piece of parchment and held it in his arm's length so that he could read it by the light of the flames, which had turned back to blue-white. "The champion for Durmstrang," he read in a strong, clear voice, "will be Victor Krum." "No surprises there," yelled Ron as a storm of applause and cheering swept the hall. Harry saw Victor Krum rise from the Slytherin table and slouch up toward Dumbledore. He turned right, walked along the staff table, and disappeared through the door into the next chamber. "Bravo, Victor," boomed Karkaroff, so loudly that everyone could hear him even over all the applause. "Knew you had it in you." The clapping and chatting died down. Now everyone's attention was focused again on the goblet, which, seconds later, turned red once more. A second piece of parchment shot out of it, propelled by the flames. "The champion for Beauxbaton," said Dumbledore, "is Fleur Delacour." "It's her, Ron!" Harry shouted as the girl, who so resembled Avila, got gracefully to her feet, shook back her sheet of silvery blonde hair, and swept up between the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff tables. "Oh, look, they're all disappointed," Hermione said over the noise, nodding toward the remainder of the Beauxbaton party. Disappointed was a bit of an understatement, Harry thought. 2 of the girls who had not been selected had dissolved into tears and were sobbing with their heads on their arms. When Fleur Delacour, too, had vanished into the side chamber, silence fell again, but this time it was a silence so stiff with excitement you could almost taste it. The Hogwarts champion next, and the goblet of fire turned red once more. Sparks showered out of it, the tongue of flames shot high into the air, and from its tip Dumbledore pulled the third piece of parchment. "The Hogwarts champion," he called, "is Cedric Diggory." "No," said Ron loudly, but nobody heard him except Harry. The uproar from the decked table was too great. Every single Hufflepuff had jumped to his or her feet, screaming and stamping as Cedric made his way past them, grinning broadly, and headed off toward the chamber behind the teacher's table. Indeed, the applause for Cedric went on so long that it was some time before Dumbledore could make himself heard again. "Excellent," Dumbledore called happily, as at last the tumult died down. "Well, we now have our 3 champions. I am sure I can count upon all of you, including the remaining students from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, to give your champions every ounce of support you can muster. By cheering your champion on, you will contribute in a very real—" But Dumbledore suddenly stopped speaking, and it was apparent to everybody what had distracted him. The fire in the goblet had just turned red again. Sparks were flying out of it. A long flame shot suddenly into the air, and borne upon it was another piece of parchment. Automatically, it seemed, Dumbledore reached out a long hand and seized the parchment. He held it out and stared at the name written upon it. There was a long pause, during which Dumbledore stared at the slip in his hands, and everyone in the room stared at Dumbledore, and then Dumbledore cleared his throat and read out, "Harry Potter." Kind of suspicious how Harry's name got in there when he never even put his name in there to begin with. He never even chanced it. He didn't even walk to the thing to even chance it. I mean, he probably thought about it at first to do it, but he never even had the inkling of even trying to do it, let alone even do it. So it's kind of surprising how his name got in there, but I guess we'll find out how it happened. Chapter 17, The 4 Champions. Harry sat there aware that every head in the Great Hall had turned to look at him. He was stunned. He felt numb. He was surely dreaming. He had not heard correctly. There was no applause. A buzzing as though of angry bees was starting to fill the hall. Some students were standing up to get a better look at Harry as he sat frozen in his seat. Up at the top table, Professor McGonagall had got to her feet and swept past little Bagman and Professor Karkaroff to whisper urgently to Professor Dumbledore, who bent his ear toward her, frowning slightly. Harry turned to Ron and Hermione beyond them. He saw the long Gryffindor table all watching him, open-mouthed. "I didn't put my name in," Harry said blankly. "You know I didn't." Both of them stared just as blankly back. At the top table, Professor McGonagall had straightened up, nodding to Professor Dumbledore had straightened up, nodding to Professor McGonagall. "Harry Potter," he called again. "Harry, up here, if you please." "Go on," Hermione whispered, giving Harry a slight push. Harry got to his feet, trod on the hem of his robes, and stumbled slightly. He set off up the gap between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables. It felt like an immensely long walk. The top table didn't seem to be getting any nearer at all, and he could feel hundreds and hundreds of eyes upon him, as though each were a searchlight. The buzzing grew louder and louder. After what seemed like an hour, he was right in front of Dumbledore, feeling the stares of all the teachers upon him. "Well, through the door, Harry," said Dumbledore. He wasn't smiling. Harry moved off along the teacher's table. Hagrid was seated right at the end. He did not wink at Harry, or wave, or give any of his usual signs of greeting. He looked completely astonished, and stared at Harry as he passed like everyone else. Harry went through the door out of the great hall, and found himself in a smaller room lined with paintings of witches and wizards. A handsome fire was soaring in the fireplace opposite him. The faces in the portraits turned to look at him as he entered. He saw a wizened witch flit out of the frame of her picture and into the one next to it, which contained a wizard with a walrus mustache. The wizened witch started whispering in his ear. Victor Crumb, Cedric Diggory, and Fleur Delacour were grouped around the fire. They looked strangely impressive, silhouetted against the flames. Crumb, hunched up and brooding, was leaning against the mantelpiece, slightly apart from the other two. Cedric was standing with his hands behind his back, staring into the fire. Fleur Delacour looked around when Harry walked in and threw back her sheet of long silvery hair. "What is it?" she said. "Do they want us back in the hall?" She thought he had come to deliver a message. Harry didn't know how to explain what had just happened. He just stood there looking at the three champions. It struck him how very tall all of them were. There was a sound of scurrying feet behind him, and little Bagman entered the room. He took Harry by the arm and led him forward. "Extraordinary," he muttered, squeezing Harry's arm. "Absolutely extraordinary. Gentlemen, lady," he added, approaching the fireside and addressing the other three, "may I introduce, incredible though it may seem, the fourth Triwizard Champion." Victor Crumb straightened up. His surly face darkened as he surveyed Harry. Cedric looked nonplussed. He looked from Bagman to Harry and back again, as though sure he must have misheard what Bagman had said. Fleur Delacour, however, tossed her hair smiling and said, "Oh, very funny joke, Meester Bagman." "Joke?" Bagman repeated, bewildered. No, not at all. Harry's name just came out of the goblet of fire." Crumb's thick eyebrows contracted slightly. Cedric was still looking politely bewildered. Fleur frowned. "But evidently there has been a mistake," she said contemptuously to Bagman. "He cannot compete. He is too young." "Well, it is amazing," said Bagman, rubbing his smooth chin and smiling down at Harry, "but as you know, the age restriction was only imposed this year as an extra safety measure, and as his name's come out of the goblet, I don't think there can be any ducking out at this stage. It's down in the rules. You're obliged. Harry will just have to do the best he." The door behind them opened again, and a large group of people came in. Professor Dumbledore, followed closely by Mr. Crouch, Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxim, Professor McGonagall, and Professor Snape. Harry heard the buzzing of the hundreds of students on the other side of the wall before Professor McGonagall closed the door. "Madame Maxim," said Fleur at once, striding over to her headmistress, "they are saying that this little boy is to compete also." Somewhere under Harry's numb disbelief he felt a ripple of anger. Little boy. Madame Maxim had drawn herself up to her full and considerable height. The top of her handsome head brushed the candle-filled chandelier, and her gigantic black satin bosom swelled. "What is the meaning of this, Dumbledore?" she said imperiously. "I'd rather like to know that myself, Dumbledore," said Professor Karkaroff. He was wearing a steely smile, and his blue eyes were like chips of ice. "Two Hogwarts champions. I don't remember anyone telling me the host school is allowed 2 champions, or have I not read the rules carefully enough?" He gave a short and nasty laugh. "C'est impossible," said Madame Maxim, whose enormous hand with its many superb opals was resting upon Fleur's shoulder. "Hogwarts cannot have 2 champions. It is most unjust. We were under the impression that your age line would keep out younger contestants, Dumbledore," said Karkaroff, his steely smile still in place, though his eyes were colder than ever. "Otherwise we would, of course, have brought along a wider selection of candidates from our own schools. It's no one's fault but Potter's, Karkaroff. said Snape softly. His black eyes were alight with malice. Don't go blaming Dumbledore for Potter's determination to break rules. He has been crossing lines ever since he arrived here. Thank you, Severus, said Dumbledore firmly, and Snape went quiet, though his eyes still glinted malevolently through his curtain of greasy black hair. Professor Dumbledore was now looking down at Harry, who looked right back at him, trying to discern the expression of the eyes behind the half-moon spectacles. Did you put your name into the Goblet of Fire, Harry? He asked calmly. No, said Harry. He was very aware of everybody watching him closely. Snape made a soft noise of impatient disbelief in the shadows. Did you ask an older student to put it into the Goblet of Fire for you? Said Professor Dumbledore, ignoring Snape. No, said Harry vehemently. Ah, but of course he is lying, cried Madame Maxim. Snape was now shaking his head, his lip curling. He could not have crossed the age line, Professor McGonagall sharply. I am sure we are all agreed on that. Dumbledore must have made a mistake with the line, said Madame Maxim, shrugging. It isn't possible, of course, said Dumbledore politely. Dumbledore, you know perfectly well you did not make a mistake, said Professor McGonagall angrily. Really, what nonsense. Harry could not have crossed the line himself, and as Professor Dumbledore believes that he did not persuade an older student to do it for him, I'm sure that should be good enough for everybody else. She shot a very angry look at Professor Snape. Mr. Crouch, Mr. Bagman, said Karkaroff, his voice unctuous once more. You are our objective judges. Surely you will agree that this is most irregular. Bagman whipped his round, boyish face with his handkerchief and looked at Mr. Crouch, who was standing outside the circle of the firelight, his face half hidden in shadow. He looked slightly eerie, the half-darkness making him look much older, giving him an almost skull-like appearance. When he spoke, however, it was in his usual curt voice. We must follow the rules, and the rules state clearly that those people whose names come out of the Goblet of Fire are bound to compete in the tournament. Well, Barty knows the rule book back to front, said Bagman, beaming and turning back to Karkaroff and Madame Maxim, as though the matter was now closed. I insist upon resubmitting the names of the rest of my students, said Karkaroff. He had dropped his unctuous tone and his smile now. His face wore a very ugly look indeed. You will set up the Goblet of Fire once more, and we will continue adding names until each school has 2 champions. It's only fair, Dumbledore. But Karkaroff, it doesn't work like that, said Bagman. The Goblet of Fire's just gone out. It won't reignite until the start of the next tournament, in which Durmstrang will most certainly not be competing, exploded Karkaroff. After all our meetings and negotiations and compromises, I little expected something of this nature to occur. I have half a mind to leave now. Empty threat, Karkaroff, growled a voice from near the door. You can't leave your champion now. He's got to compete. They've all got to compete. Binding magical contract. Like Dumbledore said, convenient, eh? Moody had just entered the room. He limped toward the fire, and with every right step he took, there was a loud clunk. Convenient, said Karkaroff. I'm afraid I don't understand you, Moody. Harry could tell he was trying to sound disdainful, as though what Moody was saying was barely worth his notice, but his hands gave him away. They had balled themselves into fists. Don't you? Said Moody quietly. It's very simple, Karkaroff. Someone put Potter's name in that goblet, knowing he'd have to compete if it came out. Evidently someone who wished to give Hogwarts 2 bites at the apple, said Madame Maxim. I quite agree, Madame Maxim, said Karkaroff, bowing to her. I shall be lodging complaints with the Ministry of Magic and the International Confederation of Wizards. If anyone's got reason to complain, it's Potter, growled Moody. But funny thing, I don't hear him saying a word. Why should he complain? Burst out Fleur Delacour, stamping her foot. He has the chance to compete, hasn't he? We have all been hoping to be chosen for weeks and weeks. The honor for our schools, 1,000 galleons in prize money. This is a chance many would die for. Maybe someone's hoping Potter is going to die for it, said Moody, with the merest trace of a growl. An extremely tense silence followed these words. Little Bagman, who was looking very anxious indeed, bounced nervously up and down on his foot and said, Moody, old man, what a thing to say. We all know Professor Moody considers the morning wasted if he hasn't discovered 6 plots to murder him before lunchtime, said Karkaroff loudly. Apparently he is now teaching his students to fear assassination too, an odd quality in defense against the dark arts teacher, Dumbledore, but no doubt you had your reasons. Imagining things, am I? Growled Moody. Seeing things, eh? It was a skilled witch or wizard who put the boy's name in that goblet. What evidence is there of that? Said Madame Maxim, throwing up her huge hands. Because they hoodwinked a very powerful magical object, said Moody. It would have needed an exceptionally strong confundus charm to bamboozle that goblet into forgetting that only 3 schools compete in the tournament. I'm guessing they submitted Potter's name under a 4th school to make sure he was the only one in his category. You seem to have given "This a great deal of thought, Moody," said Karkaroff coldly, "and a very ingenious theory it is, though of course I heard you recently got it into your head that one of your birthday presents contained a cunningly disguised basilisk egg and smashed it to pieces before realizing it was a carriage clock, so you'll understand if we don't take you entirely seriously. There are those who'll turn innocent occasions to their advantage," Moody retorted in a menacing voice. "It's my job to think the way dark wizards do, Karkaroff, as you ought to remember." "Alistair," said Dumbledore warningly. Harry wondered for a moment whom he was speaking to, but then realized Mad-Eye could hardly be Moody's real first name. Moody fell silent, though still surveying Karkaroff with satisfaction. Karkaroff's face was burning. "How this situation arose, we do not know," said Dumbledore, speaking to everyone gathered in the room. "It seems to me, however, that we have no choice but to accept it. Both Cedric and Harry have been chosen to compete in the tournament. This, therefore, they will do. Ah, but Dumbledore, my dear Madame Maxim, if you have an alternative, I would be delighted to hear it." Dumbledore waited, but Madame Maxim did not speak. She merely glared. She wasn't the only one either. Snape looked furious. Karkaroff livid. Bagman, however, looked rather excited. "Well, shall we crack on, then?" he said, rubbing his hands together and smiling around the room. "Got to give our champions their instructions, haven't we? Barty, want to do the honors?" Mr. Crouch seemed to come out of a deep reverie. "Yes," he said, "instructions. Yes, the first task." He moved forward into the firelight. Close up, Harry thought he looked ill. There were dark shadows beneath his eyes and a thin, papery look about his wrinkled skin that had not been there at the Quidditch World Cup. "The first task is designed to test your daring," he told Harry, Cedric, Fleur, and Victor, "so we are not going to be telling you what it is. Courage in the face of the unknown is an important quality in a wizard. Very important. The first test will take place on November the 24th in front of the other students and the panel of judges. The champions are not permitted to ask for or accept help of any kind from their teachers to complete the tasks in the tournament. The champions will face the first challenge armed only with their wands. They will receive information about the second task when the first is over. Owing to the demanding and time-consuming nature of the tournament, the champions are exempted from end-of-year tests." Mr. Crouch turned to look at Dumbledore. "I think that's all, is it, Albus?" "I think so," said Dumbledore, who was looking at Mr. Crouch with mild concern. "Are you sure you wouldn't like to stay at Hogwarts tonight, Barty?" "No, Dumbledore. I must get back to the Ministry," said Mr. Crouch. "It is a very busy, very difficult time at the moment. I've left young Weatherby in charge. Very enthusiastic. A little over-enthusiastic, if truth be told. You'll come and have a drink before you go, at least," said Dumbledore. "Come on, Barty." "I'm staying," said Bagman brightly. "It's all happening in Hogwarts now, you know. Much more exciting here than at the office." "I think not, Luddo," said Crouch, with a touch of his old impatience. "Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxim, a nightcap," said Dumbledore. Madame Maxim had already put her arm around Fleur's shoulders and was leading her swiftly out of the room. Harry could hear them both talking very fast in French as they went off into the great hall. Karkaroff beckoned to Krum, and they too exited, though in silence. "Harry, Cedric, I suggest you go up to bed," said Dumbledore, smiling at both of them. "I am sure Gryffindor and Hufflepuff are waiting to celebrate with you, and it would be a shame to deprive them of this excellent excuse to make a great deal of mess and noise." Harry glanced at Cedric, who nodded, and they left together. The great hall was deserted now. The candles had burned low, giving the jagged smiles of the pumpkins an eerie, flickering quality. "So," said Cedric, with a slight smile, "we're playing against each other again." "I suppose," said Harry. He really couldn't think of anything to say. The inside of his head seemed to be in complete disarray, as though his brain had been ransacked. "So tell me," said Cedric, as they reached the entrance hall, which was now lit only by torches in the absence of the goblet of fire, "how did you get your name in?" "I didn't," said Harry, staring up at him. "I didn't put it in. I was telling the truth." "Ah, okay," said Cedric. Harry could tell Cedric didn't believe him. "Well, see you then." Instead of going up the marble staircase, Cedric headed for a door to its right. Harry stood listening to him going down the stone steps beyond it. Then, slowly, he started to climb the marble ones. Was anyone except Ron and Hermione going to believe him, or would they all think he'd put himself in for the tournament? Yet how could anyone think that when he was facing competitors who'd had 3 years more magical education than he had, when he was now facing tasks that not only sounded very dangerous, but which were to be performed in front of hundreds of people? Yes, he'd thought about it. He'd fantasized about it. But it had been a joke, really, an idle sort of dream. He'd never really seriously considered entering. But someone else had considered it. Someone else had wanted him in the tournament and had made sure he was entered. Why? To give him a treat? He didn't think so, somehow. To see him make a fool of himself? Well, they were likely to get their wish. But to get him killed? Was Moody just being his usual paranoid self? Couldn't someone have put Harry's name in the goblet as a trick, a practical joke? Did anyone really want him dead? Harry was able to answer that at once. Yes, someone wanted him dead. Someone had wanted him dead ever since he had been a year old, Lord Voldemort. But how could Voldemort have ensured that Harry's name got into the Goblet of Fire? Voldemort was supposed to be far away, in some distant country, and hiding alone, feeble and powerless. Yet in that dream he had had, just before he had awoken with his scar hurting, Voldemort had not been alone. He had been talking to Wormtail, plotting Harry's murder. Harry got a shock to find himself facing the fat lady already. He had barely noticed where his feet were carrying him. It was also a surprise to see that she was not alone in her frame. The wizened witch who had flitted into her neighbor's painting when he had joined the champions downstairs was now sitting smugly beside the fat lady. She must have dashed through every picture-lining 7 staircases to reach here before him. Both she and the fat lady were looking down at him with the keenest interest. Well, 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 said the fat lady. Violet's just told me everything. Who's just been chosen as school champion, then? Balderdash, said Harry dully. It most certainly isn't, said the pale witch indignantly. No, no, it's the password, said the fat lady soothingly, and she swung forward on her hinges to let Harry into the common room. The blast of noise that met Harry's ears when the portrait opened almost knocked him backward. Next thing he knew, he was being wrenched inside the common room by about a dozen pairs of hands and was facing the whole of Gryffindor House, all of whom were screaming, applauding, and whistling. You should have told us you'd entered, bellowed Fred. He looked half annoyed, half deeply impressed. How did you do it without getting a beard? Brilliant, roared George. I didn't, Harry said. I don't know how. But Angelina had now swooped down upon him. Oh, if it couldn't be me, at least it's a Gryffindor. You'll be able to pay back Diggory for that last Quidditch match, Harry, shrieked Katie Bell, another of the Gryffindor chasers. We've got food, Harry. Come and have some. I'm not hungry. I had enough at the feast. But nobody wanted to hear that he wasn't hungry. Nobody wanted to hear that he hadn't put his name in the goblet. Not one single person seemed to have noticed that he wasn't at all in the mood to celebrate. Lee Jordan had unearthed a Gryffindor banner from somewhere, and he insisted on draping it around Harry like a cloak. Harry couldn't get away. Whenever he tried to sidle over to the staircase up to the dormitories, the crowd around him closed ranks, forcing another butterbeer on him, stuffing crisps and peanuts into his hands. Everyone wanted to know how he had done it, how he had tricked Dumbledore's age line and managed to get his name into the goblet. I didn't, he said over and over again. I don't know how it happened. But for all the notice anyone took, he might just as well not have answered at all. I'm tired, he bellowed finally after nearly half an hour. No, seriously, George, I'm going to bed. He wanted more than anything to find Ron and Hermione, to find a bit of sanity, but neither of them seemed to be in the common room. Insisting that he needed to sleep, insisting that he needed to sleep and almost flattening the little Creevy brothers as they attempted to waylay him at the foot of the stairs, Harry managed to shake everyone off and climb up to the dormitory as fast as he could. To his great relief, he found Ron was lying on his bed in the otherwise empty dormitory, still fully dressed. He looked up when Harry slammed the door behind him. Where have you been? Harry said. Oh, hello, said Ron. He was grinning, but it was very odd, strange sort of grin. Harry suddenly became aware that he was still wearing the Scarlet Gryffindor banner that Lee had tied around him. He hastened to take it off, but it was knotted very tightly. Ron lay on the bed without moving, watching Harry struggle to remove it. So, he said, when Harry had finally removed the banner and thrown it into a corner, congratulations. What do you mean, congratulations? Said Harry, staring at Ron. There was definitely something wrong with the way Ron was smiling. It was more like a grimace. Well, no one else got across the age line, said Ron, not even Fred and George. What did you use? The invisibility cloak? The invisibility cloak wouldn't have got me over that line, said Harry slowly. Oh, right, said Ron. I thought you might have told me if it was the cloak, because it would have covered both of us, wouldn't it? But you found another way, did you? Listen, said Harry, I didn't put my name in that goblet. Someone else must have done it. Ron raised his eyebrows. What would they do that? What would they do that for? I don't know, said Harry. He felt it would sound very melodramatic to say, to kill me. Ron's eyebrows rose so high that they were in danger of disappearing into his hair. It's okay, you know, you can tell me the truth, he said. If you don't want anyone else to know, fine, but I don't know why you're bothering to lie. You didn't get into trouble for it, did you? That friend of the fat lady's, that Violet, she's already told us all Dumbledore's letting you enter. 1,000 galleons prize money, eh? And you don't have to do end-of-year tests either. I didn't put my name in that goblet, said Harry, starting to feel angry. Yeah, okay, said Ron, in exactly the same skeptical tone as Cedric, only you said this morning you'd have done it last night, and no one would have seen you. I'm not stupid, you know. You're doing a really good impression of it, Harry snapped. Yeah, said Ron, and there was no trace of a grin, forced or otherwise, on his face now. You want to get to bed, Harry. I expect you'll need to be up early tomorrow for a photo call or something. He wrenched the hanging shutter on his four-poster, leaving Harry standing there by the door, staring at the dark red velvet curtains. now hiding one of the few people he had been sure would believe him. Well, that kind of sucks. He doesn't believe him at all. Chapter 18. The Weighing of the Wands. When Harry woke up on Sunday morning, it took him a moment to remember why he felt so miserable and worried. Then the memory of the previous night rolled over him. He sat up and ripped back the curtains of his own four-poster, intending to talk to Ron, to force Ron to believe him, only to find that Ron's bed was empty. He had obviously gone down to breakfast. Harry dressed and went down the spiral staircase into the common room. The moment he appeared, the people who had already finished breakfast broke into applause again. The prospect of going down into the Great Hall and facing the rest of the Gryffindors, all treating him like some sort of hero, was not inviting. It was that, however, or stay here and allow himself to be cornered by the Creevy brothers, who were both beckoning frantically to him to join them. He walked resolutely over to the portrait hole, pushed it open, climbed out of it, and found himself face to face with Hermione. "Hello," she said, holding up a stack of toast which she was carrying in a napkin. "I brought you this. Want to go for a walk?" "Good idea," said Harry gratefully. They went downstairs, crossed the entrance hall quickly without looking in at the Great Hall, and were soon striding across the lawn toward the lake where the Durmstrang ship was moored, reflected blackly in the water. It was a chilly morning, and they kept moving, munching their toast as Harry told Hermione exactly what had happened after he had left the Gryffindor table the night before. To his immense relief, Hermione accepted his story without question. "Well, of course I knew you hadn't entered yourself," she said when he had finished telling her about the scene in the chamber of the hall. "The look on your face when Dumbledore read out your name. But the question is, who did put it in? Because Moody's right, Harry. I don't think any student could have done it. They'd never be able to fool the goblet or get over Dumbledore's." "Have you seen Ron?" Harry interrupted. Hermione hesitated. Yes, he was at breakfast," she said. "Does he still think I entered myself?" "Well, no, I don't think so." "Not really," said Hermione awkwardly. "What's that supposed to mean, not really?" "Oh, Harry, isn't it obvious?" Hermione said despairingly. "He's jealous." "Jealous?" Harry said incredulously. "Jealous of what? He wants to make a prat of himself in front of the whole school, does he?" "Look," said Hermione patiently, "it's always you who gets all the attention. You know it is. I know it's not your fault," she added quickly, seeing Harry open his mouth furiously. "I know you don't ask for it, but, well, Ron's got all those brothers to compete against at home, and you're his best friend, and you're really famous. He's always shunted to one side whenever people see you, and he puts up with it, and he never mentions it. But I suppose this is just one time too many." "Great," said Harry bitterly, "really great. Tell him from me I'll swap any time he wants. Tell him from me he's welcome to it. People gawping at my forehead everywhere I go." "I'm not telling him anything," Hermione said shortly. "Tell him yourself. It's the only way to sort this out. I'm not running around after him trying to make him grow up," Harry said so loudly that several owls in a nearby tree took flight in alarm. "Maybe he'll believe I'm not enjoying myself once I've got my neck broken, or—" "That's not funny," said Hermione quietly. "That's not funny at all." She looked extremely anxious. "Harry, I've been thinking. You know what we've got to do, don't you? Straight away, the moment we get back to the castle. Yeah, give Ron a good kick up the— Right to Sirius. You've got to tell him what's happened. He asked you to keep him posted on everything that's going on at Hogwarts. It's almost as if he expected something like this to happen. I brought some parchment and a quill out with me." "Come off it," said Harry, looking around to check that they couldn't be overheard, but the grounds were quite deserted. "He came back to the country just because my scar twinged. He'll probably come bursting right into the castle if I tell him someone's entered me in the Triwizard Tournament." "He'd want you to tell him," said Hermione sternly. "He's going to find out anyway." "How?" "Harry, this isn't going to be kept quiet," said Hermione very seriously. "This tournament's famous, and you're famous. I'll be really surprised if there isn't anything in the Daily Prophet about you competing. You're already in half the books about you-know-who, and Sirius would rather hear it from you. I know he would." Okay, I'll write to him," said Harry, throwing his last piece of toast into the lake. They both stood and watched it floating there for a moment before a large tentacle rose out of the water and scooped it beneath the surface. Then they returned to the castle. "Whose owl am I going to use?" Harry said as they climbed the stairs. "He told me not to use Hedwig again. Ask Ron if you can borrow—" "I'm not asking Ron for anything," Harry said flatly. "Well, borrow one of the school owls, then. Anyone can use them," said Hermione. They went up to the owlry. Hermione gave Harry a piece of parchment, a quill, and a bottle of ink, then strolled around the long lines of perches, looking at all the different owls, while Harry sat down against a wall and wrote his letter. "Dear Sirius, you told me to keep you posted on what's happening at Hogwarts, so here goes. I don't know if you've heard, but the Triwizard Tournament's happening this year, and on Saturday night I got picked as a 4th champion. I don't know who put my name in the Goblet of Fire, because I didn't. The other Hogwarts champion is Cedric Diggory from Hufflepuff." He paused at this point, thinking. He had an urge to say something about the large weight of anxiety that seemed to have settled inside his chest since last night, but he couldn't think how to translate this into words, so he simply dipped his quill back into the ink bottle and wrote, "Hope you're okay," and Buckbeak, Harry. Finished, he told Hermione, getting to his feet and brushing straw off his robes. At this, Hedwig came fluttering down onto his shoulder and held out her leg. "I can't use you," Hermione told her, looking around for the school owls. "I've got to use one of these." Hedwig gave a very loud hoot and took off so suddenly that her talons cut into his shoulder. She kept her back to Harry all the time he was tying this letter to the leg of a large barn owl. When the barn owl had flown off, Harry reached out to stroke Hedwig, but she clicked her beak furiously and soared up into the rafters out of reach. "First Ron, then you," said Harry angrily. "This isn't my fault." If Harry had thought that matters would improve once everyone got used to the idea of him being champion, the following day showed him how mistaken he was. He could no longer avoid the rest of the school once he was back at lessons, and it was clear that the rest of the school, just like the Gryffindors, that Harry had entered himself for the tournament. Unlike the Gryffindors, however, they did not seem impressed. The Hufflepuffs, who were usually on excellent terms with the Gryffindors, had turned remarkably cold toward the whole lot of them. One herbology lesson was enough to demonstrate this. It was plain that the Hufflepuffs felt that Harry had stolen their champion's glory, a feeling exacerbated perhaps by the fact that Hufflepuff House very rarely got any glory, and that Cedric was one of the few who had ever given them any, having beaten Gryffindor once at Quidditch. Ernie Macmillan and Justin Finch Fletchley, with whom Harry normally got on very well, did not talk to him even though they were repotting bouncing bulbs at the same tray. Though they did laugh rather unpleasantly when one of the bouncing bulbs wiggled free from Harry's grip and smacked him hard in the face. Ron wasn't talking to Harry either. Hermione sat between them, making very forced conversation, but though both answered her normally, they avoided making eye contact with each other. Harry thought even Professor Sprout seemed distant with him, but then she was head of Hufflepuff House. He would have been looking forward to seeing Hagrid under normal circumstances, but care of magical creatures meant seeing the Slytherins too, the first time he would come face to face with them since becoming champion. Predictably, Malfoy arrived at Hagrid's cabin with his familiar sneer firmly in place. "Ah, look, boys, it's the champion," he said to Crabbe and Goyle the moment he got within earshot of Harry. "Got your autograph books. Better get his signature now, because I doubt he's going to be around much longer. Half the Triwizard champions have died. How long do you reckon you're going to last, Potter? 10 minutes into the first task's my bet." Crabbe and Goyle guffawed sycophantically, but Malfoy had to stop there because Hagrid emerged from the back of his cabin balancing a teetering tower of crates, each containing a very large blast-ended Scroot. To the class's horror, Hagrid proceeded to explain that the reason the Scroots had been killing one another was an excess of pent-up energy, and that the solution would be for each student to fix a leash on a Scroot and take it for a short walk. The only good thing about this plan was that it distracted Malfoy completely. "Take this thing for a walk?" he repeated in disgust, staring into one of the boxes. "And where exactly are we supposed to fix the leash? Around the sting, the blasting end, or the sucker?" "Round the middle," said Hagrid, demonstrating. Yeah, might want to put on your dragonhide gloves, just as an extra precaution, like. Harry, you come here and help me with this big one." Hagrid's real intention, however, was to talk to Harry away from the rest of the class. He waited until everyone else had set off with their Scroots, then turned to Harry and said very seriously, "So you're competing, Harry, in the tournament. School champion." "One of the champions," Harry corrected him. Hagrid's beetle-black eyes looked very anxious under his wild eyebrows. "No idea who put you in for it, Harry." "You believe I didn't do it, then?" said Harry, concealing with difficulty the rush of gratitude he felt at Hagrid's words. "Course I do," Hagrid grunted. "You say it wasn't you, and I believe you. And Dumbledore believes you and all." "Wish I knew who did do it," said Harry bitterly. The pair of them looked out over the lawn. The class was widely scattered now, and all in great difficulty. The Scroots were now over 3 feet long and extremely powerful. No longer shellless and colorless, they had developed a kind of thick, grayish, shiny armor. They looked like a cross between giant scorpions and elongated crabs, but still without recognizable heads or eyes. They had become immensely strong and very hard to control. Look like they're having fun, don't they?" Hagrid said happily. Harry assumed he was talking about the Scroots, because his classmates certainly weren't. Every now and then, with an alarming bang, one of the Scroots' ends would explode, causing it to shoot forward several yards, and more than one person was being dragged along on their stomach, trying desperately to get back on their feet. "Ah, I don't know, Harry," Hagrid sighed, suddenly looking back down at him with a worried expression on his face. "School champion. Everything seems to happen to you, doesn't it?" Harry didn't answer. Yes, everything did seem to happen to him. That was more or less what Hermione had said as they had walked around the lake, and that was the reason, according to her, that Ron was no longer talking to him. It does seem kind of suspicious that every single thing seems to be happening to him, and it's not even his fault either. He didn't ask for it. He didn't put his name in there, and he wasn't really asking for trouble or anything either. The next few days were some of Harry's worst at Hogwarts. The closest he had ever come to feeling like this had been during those months, in his second year when a large part of the school had suspected him of attacking his fellow students. But Ron had been on his side then. He thought he could have coped with the rest of the school's behavior if he could just have had Ron back as a friend, but he wasn't going to try and persuade Ron to talk to him if Ron didn't want to. Nevertheless, it was lonely with dislike pouring in on him from all sides. He could understand the Hufflepuff's attitude, even if he didn't like it. They had their own champion to support. He expected nothing less than vicious insults from the Slytherins. He was highly unpopular there, and always had been, because he had helped Gryffindor beat them so often, both at Quidditch and in the Inter-House Championship. But he had hoped the Ravenclaws might have found it in their hearts to support him as much as Cedric. He was wrong, however. Most Ravenclaws seemed to think that he had been desperate to earn himself a bit more fame by tricking the Goblet into accepting his name. Then there was the fact that Cedric looked the part of a champion so much more than he did. Exceptionally handsome, with a straight nose, dark hair, and gray eyes, and it was hard to say who was receiving more admiration these days, Cedric or Victor Crumb. Harry actually saw the same 6-year girls who had been so keen to get Crumb's autograph begging Cedric to sign their school books one lunchtime. Meanwhile, there was no reply from Sirius. Hedwig was refusing to come anywhere near him. Professor Trelawney was predicting his death with even more certainty than usual, and he did so badly at summoning charms in Professor Flitwick's class that he was given extra homework, the only person to get any, apart from Neville. It's really not that difficult, Harry, Hermione tried to reassure him as they left Flitwick's class. She'd been making objects zoom across the room to her all lesson, as though she were some sort of weird magnet for board dusters, waste paper baskets, and lunoscopes. You just weren't concentrating properly. Wonder why that was, said Harry darkly as Cedric Diggory walked past, surrounded by a large group of simpering girls, all of whom looked at Harry as though he were a particularly large blast-ended scroot. Still, never mind, eh? Double potions to look forward to this afternoon. Double potions was always a horrible experience, but these days it was nothing short of torture. Being shut in a dungeon for an hour and a half with Snape and the Slytherins, all of whom seemed determined to punish Harry as much as possible for daring to become school champion, was about the most unpleasant thing Harry could imagine. He had already struggled through one Friday's worth with Hermione sitting next to him, intoning, "Ignore them, ignore them, ignore them," under her breath, and he couldn't see why today should be any different. When he and Hermione arrived at Snape's dungeon after lunch, they found the Slytherins waiting outside, each and every one of them wearing a large badge on the front of his or her robes. For one wild moment, Harry thought they were SPEW badges. Then he saw that they all bore the same message in luminous red letters that burned brightly in the dimly lit underground passage. Support Cedric Diggory, the real Hogwarts champion. Like them, Potter? Said Malfoy loudly as Harry approached. And this isn't all they do. Look. He pressed his badge into his chest, and the message upon it vanished, to be replaced by another one which glowed green. Potter stinks. The Slytherins howled with laughter. Each of them pressed their badges too, until the message, Potter stinks, was shining brightly all around Harry. He felt the heat rise in his face and neck. "Oh, very funny," Hermione said sarcastically to Pansy Parkinson and her gang of Slytherin girls, who were laughing harder than anyone. "Really witty." Ron was standing against the wall with Dean and Seamus. He wasn't laughing, but he wasn't sticking up for Harry either. "Want one, Granger?" said Malfoy, holding out a badge to Hermione. "I've got loads. But don't touch my hand now. I've just washed it, you see. Don't want a mudblood sliming it up." Some of the anger Harry had been feeling for days and days seemed to burst through a dam in his chest. He had reached for his wand before he'd thought what he was doing. People all around them scrambled out of the way, backing down the corridor. "Harry," Hermione said warningly. "Go on then, Potter," Malfoy said quietly, drawing out his own wand. "Moody's not here to look after you now. Do it, if you've got the guts." For a split second, they looked into each other's eyes, then at exactly the same time, both acted. "Furnunculus," Harry yelled. "Densogio," screamed Malfoy. Jets of light shot from both wands, hit each other in midair, and ricocheted off at angles. Harry's hit Goyle in the face, and Malfoy's hit Hermione. Goyle bellowed and put his hands to his nose, where great, ugly boils were springing up. Hermione, whimpering in panic, was clutching her mouth. Ron had hurried forward to see what was wrong with her. Harry turned and saw Ron dragging Hermione's hand away from her face. It wasn't a pretty sight. Hermione's front teeth, already larger than average, were now growing at an alarming rate. She was looking more and more like a beaver as her teeth elongated past her bottom lip, toward her chin. Panic-stricken, she felt them and let out a terrified cry. "And what is all this noise about?" said a soft, deadly voice. Snape had arrived. The Slytherins clamored to give their explanations. Snape pointed a long, yellow finger at Malfoy and said, "Explain." "Potter attacked me, sir." "We attacked each other at the same time," Harry shouted, "and he hit Goyle. Look." Snape examined Goyle, whose face now resembled something that would have been at home in a book on poisonous fungi. "Hospital wing, Goyle," Snape said calmly. "Malfoy got Hermione," Ron said. "Look." He forced Hermione to show Snape her teeth. She was doing her best to hide them with her hands, though this was difficult as they had now grown down past her collar. Pansy Parkinson and the other Slytherin girls were doubled up with silent giggles, pointing at Hermione from behind Snape's back. Snape looked coldly at Hermione, then said, "I see no difference." Hermione let out a whimper. Her eyes filled with tears. She turned on her heel and ran all the way up the corridor and out of sight. That's kind of a terrible thing for a teacher to say. And it's kind of sad, because if you think about it, in the school systems today, everybody hears the news and watches the news and stuff like that, and teachers aren't so great, and they bully students and stuff all of the time. And to actually read it in a book that a teacher's kind of bullying a student and belittling another student, it's kind of terrible. It kind of like breaks your heart a little bit that even a teacher can be so disheartened to downgrade and emotionally abuse another student about their appearance. It was lucky, perhaps, that both Harry and Ron started shouting at Snape at the same time. Lucky their voices echoed so much in the stone corridor for the confused din. It was impossible for him to hear exactly what they were calling him. He got the gist, however. "Let's see," he said in his silkiest voice. 50 points from Gryffindor, and a detention each for Potter and Weasley. Now get inside, or it'll be a week's worth of detentions." Harry's ears were ringing. The injustice of it made him want to curse Snape into 1,000 slimy pieces. He passed Snape, walked with Ron to the back of the dungeon, and slammed his bag down onto the table. Ron was shaking with anger, too. For a moment, it felt as though everything was back to normal between them. But then Ron turned and sat down with Dean and Seamus instead, leaving Harry alone at his table. On the other side of the dungeon, Malfoy turned his back on Snape and pressed his badge, smirking. "Potter stinks," flashed once more across the room. Harry sat there staring at Snape as the lesson began, picturing horrific things happening to him. If only he knew how to do the Cruciatus Curse, he'd have Snape flat on his back like that spider, jerking and twitching. "Antidote," said Snape, looking around at them all, his cold black eyes glittering unpleasantly. "You should all have prepared your recipes now. I want you to brew them carefully, and then we will be selecting someone on whom to test one." Snape's eyes met Harry's, and Harry knew what was coming. Snape was going to poison him. Harry imagined picking up his cauldron and sprinting to the front of the class and bringing it down on Snape's greasy head. And then a knock on the dungeon door burst in on Harry's thoughts. It was Colin Creevey. He edged into the room, beaming at Harry, and walked up to Snape's desk at the front of the room. "Yes," said Snape curtly. "Please, sir, I'm supposed to take Harry Potter upstairs." Snape stared down his hooked nose at Colin, whose smile faded from his eager face. "Potter has another hour of potions to complete," said Snape coldly. "He will come upstairs when this class is finished." Colin went pink. Sir, Mr. Bagman wants him," he said nervously. "All the champions have got to go. I think they want to take photographs." Harry could have given anything he owned to have stopped Colin saying those last few words. He chanced half a glance at Ron, but Ron was staring determinedly at the ceiling. Very well, Snape snapped. "Potter, leave your things here. I want you back down here later to test your antidote." "Please, sir, he's got to take his things with him," squeaked Colin. "All the champions." "Very well," said Snape. "Potter, take your bag and get out of my sight." Harry swung his bag over his shoulder, got up, and headed for the door. As he walked through the Slytherin desks, "Potter stinks" flashed at him from every direction. "It's amazing, isn't it, Harry?" said Colin, starting to speak the moment Harry had closed the dungeon door behind him. "Isn't it, though, you being champion?" "Yeah, really amazing," said Harry heavily as they set off toward the steps into the entrance hall. "What do you want photos for, Colin?" "The Daily Prophet, I think." "Great," said Harry dully. "Exactly what I need. More publicity." "Good luck," said Colin, when they had reached the right room. Harry knocked on the door and entered. He was in a fairly small classroom. Most of the desks had been pushed away to the back of the room, leaving a large space in the middle. 3 of them, however, had been placed end to end in front of the blackboard and covered with a long length of velvet. 5 chairs had been set behind the velvet-covered desks, and Leto Bagman was sitting in one of them, talking to a witch Harry had never seen before, who was wearing magenta robes. "Oh, fuck. I think it's a stupid... Oh, man. I can't stand this lady." Victor Crumb was standing moodily in a corner as usual and not talking to anybody. Cedric and Flora were in conversation. Flora looked a good deal happier than Harry had seen her so far. She kept throwing back her head so that her long silvery hair caught the light. A paunchy man holding a large black camera that was smoking slightly was watching Flora out of the corner of his eye. Bagman suddenly spotted Harry, got up quickly, and bounded forward. Ah, here he is. Champion number 4. In you come. Harry, in you come. Nothing to worry about. It's just the wand weighing ceremony. The rest of the judges will be here in a moment. Wand weighing? Harry repeated nervously. We have to check that your wands are fully functional, no problems, as they're your most important tools in the tasks ahead, said Bagman. The expert's upstairs now with Dumbledore, and then there's going to be a little photo shoot. This is Rita Skeeter. I can't stand that woman, he added, gesturing toward the witch in magenta robes. She's doing a small piece on the tournament for the Daily Prophet. Maybe not that small, Leto, said Rita Skeeter, her eyes on Harry. Her hair was set in an elaborate and curiously rigid curls that contrasted oddly with her heavy-jawed face. She wore jeweled spectacles, the thick fingers clutching her crocodile-skin handbag ended in 2-inch nails painted crimson. I wonder if I could have a little word with Harry before we start, she said to Bagman, but still gazing fixedly at Harry. The youngest champion, to add a bit of color. Certainly, cried Bagman. That is, if Harry has no objection. Said Harry. Lovely, said Rita Skeeter, and in a second her scarlet-taloned fingers had Harry's upper arm in a surprisingly strong grip, and she was steering him out of the room again and opening a nearby door. We don't want to be in there with all that noise, she said. Let's see. Ah, yes, this is nice and cozy. It was a broom cupboard. Harry stared at her. Come along, dear. That's right. Lovely, said Rita Skeeter again, perching herself precariously upon an upturned bucket, pushing Harry down onto a cardboard box and closing the door, throwing them into darkness. Let's see now. She unsnapped a crocodile skin handbag and pulled out a handful of candles, which she lit with a wave of her wand and magicked into midair, so that they could see what they were doing. You won't mind, Harry, if I use a quick quotes quill. It leaves me free to talk to you normally. A what? Said Harry. Rita Skeeter's smile widened. Harry counted 3 gold teeth. She reached again into her gold crocodile bag and drew out a long acid-green quill and a roll of parchment, which she stretched out between them on a crate of Mrs. Scour's all-purpose magical mess remover. She put the tip of the green quill into her mouth, sucked it for a moment with apparent relish, then placed it upright on the parchment, where it stood balanced on its point, quivering slightly. Testing. My name is Rita Skeeter, Daily Prophet reporter. Harry looked down quickly at the quill. The moment Rita Skeeter had spoken, the green quill had started to scribble, skidding across the parchment. Attractive blonde Rita Skeeter, 43, whose savage quill has punctured many inflated reputations. Lovely, said Rita Skeeter yet again, and she ripped the top piece of parchment off, crumpled it up, and stuffed it into her handbag. Now she leaned toward Harry and said, So, Harry, what made you decide to enter the Triwizard Tournament? Said Harry again, but he was distracted by the quill. Even though he wasn't speaking, it was dashing across the parchment, and in its wake, he could make out a fresh sentence. An ugly scar, souvenir of a tragic past, disfigures the otherwise charming face of Harry Potter, whose eyes— Ignore the quill, Harry, said Rita Skeeter firmly. Reluctantly, Harry looked up at her instead. Now, why did you decide to enter the tournament, Harry? I didn't, said Harry. I don't know how my name got into the Goblet of Fire. I didn't put it in there. Rita Skeeter raised one heavily penciled eyebrow. Come now, Harry, there's no need to be scared of getting into trouble. We all know you shouldn't really have entered at all, but don't worry about that. Our readers love a rebel. But I didn't enter, Harry repeated. I don't know who. How do you feel about the tasks ahead? Said Rita Skeeter. Excited? Nervous? I haven't really thought. Yeah, nervous, I suppose, said Harry. His insides squirmed uncomfortably as he spoke. Champions have died in the past, haven't they? Said Rita Skeeter briskly. Have you thought about that at all? Well, they say it's going to be a lot safer this year, said Harry. The quill whizzed across the parchment between them, back and forward as though it were skating. Of course, you've looked death in the face before, haven't you? Said Rita Skeeter, watching him closely. How would you say that's affected you? Said Harry yet again. Do you think that the trauma in your past might have made you keen to prove yourself, to live up to your name? Do you think that perhaps you were tempted to enter the Triwizard Tournament because— I didn't enter, said Harry, starting to feel irritated. Can you remember your parents at all? Said Rita Skeeter, talking over him. No, said Harry. How do you think they'd feel if they knew you were competing in the Triwizard Tournament? Proud? Worried? Angry? Harry was feeling really annoyed now. How on earth was he to know how his parents would feel if they were alive? How could He could feel Rita Skeeter watching him very intently. Frowning, he avoided her gaze and looked down at words the quill had just written. Tears fill those startlingly green eyes as our conversation turns to the parents he can barely remember. I have not got tears in my eyes, said Harry loudly. Before Rita Skeeter could say a word, the door of the broom cupboard was pulled open. Harry looked around, blinking in the bright light. Albus Dumbledore stood there, looking down at both of them, squished into the cupboard. "Dumbledore!" cried Rita Skeeter, with every appearance of delight. But Harry noticed that her quill on the parchment had suddenly vanished from the box of magical mess remover, and Rita's clawed fingers were hastily snapping shut the clasp of her crocodile skin bag. "How are you?" she said, standing up and holding out one of her large, mannish hands to Dumbledore. "I hope you saw my piece over the summer about the International Confederation of Wizards Conference." "Enchantingly nasty," said Dumbledore, his eyes twinkling. "I particularly enjoyed your description of me as an obsolete dingbat." Rita Skeeter didn't look remotely abashed. "I was just making the point that some of your ideas are a little old-fashioned, Dumbledore, and that many wizards in the street. I will be delighted to hear the reasoning behind the rudeness, Rita," said Dumbledore, with a courteous bow and a smile. "But I'm afraid we will have to discuss the matter later. The weighing of the wands is about to start, and it cannot take place if one of our champions is hidden in a broom cupboard." Very glad to get away from Rita Skeeter, Harry hurried back into the room. The other champions were now sitting in chairs near the door, and he sat down quickly next to Cedric. Looking up the velvet-covered table where 4 of the 5 judges were now sitting, Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxim, Mr. Crouch, and little Bagman, Rita Skeeter settled herself down in a corner. Harry saw her slip the parchment out of her bag again, spread it on her knee, suck the end of the Quick-Quotes quill, and place it once more on the parchment. "May I introduce Mr. Ollivander?" said Dumbledore, taking his place at the judges' table and talking to the champions. "He will be checking your wands to ensure that they are in good condition before the tournament." Harry looked around, and with a jolt of surprise saw an old wizard with large, pale eyes standing quietly by the window. Harry had met Mr. Ollivander before. He was the wand maker from whom Harry had bought his own wand over 3 years ago in Diagon Alley. "Mademoiselle Declore, could we have you first, please?" said Mr. Ollivander, stepping into the empty space in the middle of the room. Fleur Delacour swept over to Mr. Ollivander and handed him her wand. He said. He twirled the wand between his long fingers like a baton, and it emitted a number of pink and gold sparks. Then he held it close to his eyes and examined it carefully. "Yes," he said quietly, 9½ inches, inflexible, rosewood, and containing, dear me, an heir from the Edda of Avila," said Fleur, "one of my grandmothers." So Fleur was part Vila, thought Harry, making a mental note to tell Ron. Then he remembered that Ron wasn't speaking to him. "Yes," said Mr. Ollivander, "yes, I've never used Vila hair myself. Of course, I find it makes for rather temperamental wands. However, to each his own, and if this suits you." Mr. Ollivander ran his fingers along the wand, apparently checking for scratches or bumps. Then he muttered, "Orchideus," and a bunch of flowers burst from the wand tip. "Very well, very well. It's in fine working order," said Mr. Ollivander, scooping up the flowers and handing them to Fleur with her wand. "Mr. Diggory, you next." Fleur glided back to her seat, smiling at Cedric as he passed her. "Ah, now this is one of mine, isn't it?" said Mr. Ollivander with much more enthusiasm, as Cedric handed over his wand. "Yes, I remember it well, containing a single hair from the tail of a particularly fine male unicorn. Must have been 17 hands. Nearly gored me with his horn after I plucked his tail. 12¼ inches, ash, pleasantly springy. It's in fine condition. You treat it regularly?" "Polished it last night," said Cedric, grinning. Harry looked down at his own wand. He could see finger marks all over it. He gathered a fistful of robe from his knee and tried to rub it clean, surreptitiously. Several gold sparks shot out of the end of it. Fleur Delacour gave him a very patronizing look, and he desisted. Mr. Ollivander sent a stream of silver smoke rings across the room from the tip of Cedric's wand, pronounced himself satisfied, and then said, "Mr. Crumb, if you please." Victor Crumb got up and slouched, round-shouldered and duck-footed, toward Mr. Ollivander. He thrust out his wand and stood scowling, with his hands in the pockets of his robes. Said Mr. Ollivander. "This is a Gregorovitch creation, unless I'm much mistaken. A fine wand-maker, though the styling is never quite what I... However, he lifted the wand and examined it minutely, turning it over and over before his eyes. "Yes, hornbeam and dragon heartstring," he shot at Crumb, who nodded. "Rather thicker than one usually sees, quite rigid, 10¼ inches. Avis." The hornbeam wand let off a blast like a gun, and a number of small twittering birds flew out of the end and through the open window into the watery sunlight. "Good," said Mr. Ollivander, handing Crumb back his wand, "which leaves Mr. Potter." Harry got to his feet and walked past Crumb to Mr. Ollivander. He handed over his wand. "Ah, yes," said Mr. Ollivander, his pale eyes suddenly gleaming. "Yes, yes, yes. How well I remember." Harry could remember, too. He could remember it as though it had happened yesterday. 4 summers ago, on his 11th birthday, he had entered Mr. Ollivander's shop with Hagrid to buy a wand. Mr. Ollivander had taken his measurements and then started handing him wands to try. Harry had waved what felt like every wand in the shop until at last he had found the one that suited him. This one, which was made of holly 11 inches long and contained a single feather from the tail of a phoenix. Mr. Ollivander had been very surprised that Harry had been so compatible with this wand. Curious, he had said. Curious, and not until Harry had asked what was curious had Mr. Ollivander explained that the phoenix feather in Harry's wand had come from the same bird that had supplied the core of Lord Voldemort's. Harry had never shared this piece of information with anybody. He was very fond of his wand, and as far as he was concerned, its relation to Voldemort's wand was something it couldn't help, rather as he couldn't help being related to Aunt Petunia. However, he really hoped that Mr. Ollivander wasn't about to tell the room about it. He had a funny feeling Rita Skeeter's Quick Quotes quill might just explode with excitement if he did. Mr. Ollivander spent much longer examining Harry's wand than anyone else's. Eventually, however, he made a fountain of wine shoot out of it and handed it back to Harry, announcing that it was still in perfect condition. "Thank you all," said Dumbledore, standing up at the judges' table. "You may go back to your lessons now, or perhaps it would be quicker just to go down to dinner, as they are about to end." Feeling that at last everything had gone right today, Harry got up to leave, but the man with the black camera jumped up and cleared his throat. "Photos, Dumbledore, photos!" cried Bagman excitedly. "All the judges and champions. What do you think, Rita?" Yes, let's do those first," said Rita Skeeter, whose eyes were upon Harry again, "and then perhaps some individual shots." The photographs took a long time. Madame Maxim cast everyone else into shadow wherever she stood, and the photographer couldn't stand far enough back to get her into the frame. Eventually, she had to sit while everyone else stood around her. Karkaroff kept twirling his goatee around his finger to give it an extra curl. Crumb, whom Harry would have thought would have been used to this sort of thing, skulked, half hidden, at the back of the group. The photographer seemed keenest to get Flora at the front, but Rita Skeeter kept hurrying forward and dragging Harry into greater prominence. Then she insisted on separate shots of all the champions. At last, they were free to go. Harry went down to dinner. Hermione wasn't there. He supposed she was still in the hospital wing having her teeth fixed. He ate alone at the end of the table, then returned to Gryffindor Tower, thinking of all the extra work on summoning charms that he had to do. Up in the dormitory, he came across Ron. "You've had an owl," said Ron brusquely the moment he walked in. He was pointing at Harry's pillow. The school barn owl was waiting for him there. "Oh, right," said Harry. "And we've got to do our detentions tomorrow night, Snape's dungeon," said Ron. He then walked straight out of the room, not looking at Harry. For a moment, Harry considered going after him. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to talk to him or hit him. Both seemed quite appealing. But the lure of Sirius's answer was too strong. Harry strode over to the barn owl, took the letter off its leg, and unrolled it. "Harry, I can't say everything I would like to in a letter. It's too risky, in case the owl is intercepted. We need to talk face to face. Can you ensure that you are alone by the fire in Gryffindor Tower at 1 o'clock in the morning on the 22nd of November? I know better than anyone that you can look after yourself, and while you're around Dumbledore and Moody, I don't think anyone will be able to hurt you. However, someone seems to be having a good try. Entering you in that tournament would have been very risky, especially right under Dumbledore's nose. But be on the watch, Harry. I still want to hear about anything unusual. Let me know about the 22nd of November as quickly as you can. Sirius." Alright. These chapters are kind of long this time today, guys. We still have to read one more chapter yet. We've only read three chapters. Alright. So this last chapter here is kind of a shorter one, but the last few chapters are pretty long. So here we go. Chapter 19, The Hungarian Horntail. Let me get some water. The prospect of talking face-to-face with Sirius was all that sustained Harry over the next fortnight. The only bright spot on a horizon that had never looked darker. The shock of finding himself school champion had worn off slightly now, and the fear of what was facing him had started to sink in. The first task was drawing steadily nearer. He felt as though it were crouching ahead of him like some horrific monster, barring his path. He had never suffered nerves like these. They were way beyond anything he had experienced before a Quidditch match, not even his last one against Slytherin, which had decided who would win the Quidditch Cup. Harry was finding it hard to think about the future at all. He felt as though his whole life had been leading up to and would finish with the first task. Admittedly, he didn't see how Sirius was going to make him feel any better about having to perform an unknown piece of difficult and dangerous magic in front of hundreds of people. But the mere sight of a friendly face would be something at the moment. Harry wrote back to Sirius saying that he would be beside the common room fire at the time Sirius had suggested, and he and Hermione spent a long time going over plans for forcing any stragglers out of the common room on the night in question. If the worst came to the worst, they were going to drop a bag of dung bombs, but they hoped they wouldn't have to resort to that. Filch would skin them alive. In the meantime, life became even worse for Harry within the confines of the castle, for Rita Skeeter had published a piece about the Triwizard Tournament, and it had turned out to be not so much a report on the tournament as a highly colored life story of Harry. Much of the front page had been given over to a picture of Harry. The article, continuing on pages 2, 6, and 7, had been all about Harry. The names of the Bobaton and Durmstrang champions, misspelled, had been squashed into the last line of the article, and Cedric hadn't been mentioned at all. The article had appeared 10 days ago, and Harry still got a sick, burning feeling of shame in his stomach every time he thought about it. Rita Skeeter had reported him saying an awful lot of things that he couldn't remember ever saying in his life, let alone in that broom cupboard. I suppose I get my strength from my parents. I know they'd be very proud of me if they could see me now. Yes, sometimes at night I still cry about them. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I know nothing will hurt me during the tournament because they're watching over me. But Rita Skeeter had gone even further than transforming his ers into long, sickly sentences. She had interviewed other people about him, too. Harry has at last found love at Hogwarts. His close friend Colin Creevey says that Harry is rarely seen out of the company of one Hermione Granger, a stunningly pretty Muggle-born girl who, like Harry, is one of the top students in the school. From the moment the article had appeared, Harry had had to endure people, Slytherins mainly, quoting it at him as he passed and making sneering comments. What a hanky, Potter, in case you start crying in Transfiguration. Since when have you been one of the top students in the school, Potter, or is this a school you and Longbottom have set up together? Hey, Harry. Yeah, that's right. Harry found himself shouting as he wheeled around in the corridor, having had just about enough. I've just been crying my eyes out over my dead mum, and I'm just off to do a bit more. No, it was just you dropped your quill. It was Cho. Harry felt the color rising in his face. Oh, right. Sorry, he muttered, taking the quill back. Good luck on Tuesday, she said. I really hope you do well. Which left Harry feeling extremely stupid. Hermione had come in for her fair share of unpleasantness, too, but she hadn't yet started yelling at innocent bystanders. In fact, Harry was full of admiration for the way she was handling the situation. Stunningly pretty. Her, Pansy Parkinson, had shrieked the first time she had come face to face with Hermione after Rita's article had appeared. What was she judging against? A chipmunk? Ignore it, Hermione said in a dignified voice, holding her head in the air and stalking past the sniggering Slytherin girls as though she couldn't hear them. Just ignore it, Harry. But Harry couldn't ignore it. Ron hadn't spoken to him at all since he had told him about Snape's detentions. Harry had half hoped they would make things up during the 2 hours they were forced to pickle rats' brains in Snape's dungeon, but that had been the day Rita's article had appeared, which seemed to have confirmed Ron's belief that Harry was really enjoying all the attention. Hermione was furious with the pair of them. She went from one to the other, trying to force them to talk to each other, but Harry was adamant. He would talk to Ron again only if Ron admitted that Harry hadn't put his name in the Goblet of Fire and apologized for calling him a liar. I didn't start this, Harry said stubbornly. It's his problem. You miss him, Hermione said impatiently, and I know he misses you. Miss him? Said Harry. I don't miss him. But this was a downright lie. Harry liked Hermione very much, but she just wasn't the same as Ron. There was much less laughter and a lot more hanging around in the library when Hermione was your best friend. Harry still hadn't mastered summoning charms. He seemed to have developed something of a block about them, and Hermione insisted that learning the theory would help. They consequently spent a lot of time poring over books during their lunch times. Victor Crumb was in the library an awful lot, too, and Harry wondered what he was up to. Was he studying, or was he looking for things to help him through the first task? Hermione often complained about Crumb being there, not that he ever bothered them, but because groups of giggling girls often turned up to spy on him from behind bookshelves, and Hermione found the noise distracting. He's not even good-looking, she muttered angrily, glaring at Crumb's sharp profile. They only like him because he's famous. They wouldn't look twice at him if he wouldn't do that wonky feint thing. Wronski feint, said Harry through gritted teeth. Quite apart from liking to get Quidditch terms correct, it caused him another pang to imagine Ron's expression if he could have heard Hermione talking about wonky feints. It is a strange thing, but when you are dreading something and would have anything to slow down time, it has a disobliging habit of speeding up. The days until the first task seemed to slip by as though someone had fixed the clocks to work at double speed. Harry's feelings of barely controlled panic was with him wherever he went, as ever-present as the snide comments about the Daily Prophet article. On the Saturday before the first task, all students in the third year and above were permitted to visit the village of Hogsmeade. Hermione told Harry that it would do him good to get away from the castle for a bit, and Harry didn't need much persuasion. What about Ron, though? He said. Don't you want to go with him? Oh, well, Hermione went slightly pink. I thought we might meet up with him in the Three Broomsticks. No, said Harry flatly. Oh, Harry, this is so stupid. I'll come, but I'm not meeting Ron, and I'm wearing my invisibility cloak. All right, then, Hermione snapped, but I hate talking to you in that cloak. I never know if I'm looking at you or not. So Harry put on his invisibility cloak in the dormitory, went back downstairs, and together he and Hermione set off for Hogsmeade. Harry felt wonderfully free under the cloak. He watched other students walking past them as they entered the village, most of them sporting Support Cedric Diggory badges, but no horrible remarks came his way for a change, and nobody was quoting that stupid article. People keep looking at me now, said Hermione grumpily as they came out of Honeyduke's sweet shop later, eating large cream-filled chocolates. They think I'm talking to myself. Don't move your lips so much, then. Come on. Please just take off your cloak for a bit. No one's going to bother you here. Oh, yeah, said Harry. Look behind you. Rita Skeeter and her photographer friend had just emerged from the Three Broomsticks pub, talking in low voices. They passed right by Hermione without looking at her. Harry backed into the wall of Honeydukes to stop Rita Skeeter from hitting him with their crocodile skin handbag. When they were gone, Harry said, She's staying in the village. I bet she's coming to watch the first task. As he said it, his stomach flooded with a wave of molten panic. He didn't mention this. He and Hermione hadn't discussed what was coming in the first task much. He had the feeling she didn't want to think about it. She's gone, said Hermione, looking right through Harry toward the end of the street. Why don't we go and have a butterbeer in the Three Broomsticks? It's a bit cold, isn't it? You don't have to talk to Ron, she added irritably, correctly interpreting his silence. The Three Broomsticks was packed, mainly with Hogwarts students, enjoying their free afternoon, but also with a variety of magical people Harry rarely saw anywhere else. Harry supposed that as Hogsmeade was the only all-wizard village in Britain, it was a bit of a haven for creatures like hags, who are not as adept as wizards at disguising themselves. It was very hard to move through crowds in the invisibility cloak, in case you accidentally trod on someone, which tended to lead to awkward questions. Harry edged slowly toward a spare table in the corner, while Hermione went to buy drinks. On his way through the pub, Harry spotted Ron, who was sitting with Fred, George, and Lee Jordan. Resisting the urge to give Ron a good hard poke in the back of the head, he finally reached the table and sat down at it. Hermione joined him a moment later and slipped him a butterbeer under his cloak. I look like such an idiot sitting here on my own, she muttered. Luckily, I brought something to do. And she pulled out a notebook in which she had been keeping a record of SPEW members. Harry saw his and Ron's names at the top of the very short list. It seemed a long time ago that they had sat making up those predictions together, and Hermione had turned up and appointed them secretary and treasurer. You know, maybe I should try and get some of the villagers involved in SPEW, Hermione said thoughtfully, looking around the pub. Yeah, right, said Harry. He took a swig of butterbeer under his cloak. Hermione, when are you going to give up on this spew stuff? When house elves have decent wages and working conditions, she hissed back. You know, I'm starting to think it's time for more direct action. I wonder how you get into the school kitchens. No idea. Ask Fred and George, said Harry. Hermione lapsed into thoughtful silence while Harry drank his butterbeer, watching the people in the pub. All of them looked cheerful and relaxed. Ernie Macmillan and Hannah Abbott were swapping chocolate frog cards at a nearby table, both of them sporting Support Cedric Diggory badges on their cloaks. Right over by the door, he saw Cho and a large group of her Ravenclaw friends. She wasn't wearing a Cedric badge, though. This cheered up Harry very slightly. What wouldn't he have given to be one of these people, sitting around laughing and talking, with nothing to worry about but homework? He imagined how it would have felt to be here if his name hadn't come out of the Goblet of Fire. He wouldn't be wearing the invisibility cloak, for one thing. Ron would be sitting with him. The three of them would probably be happily imagining what deadly dangerous task the school champions would be facing on Tuesday. He'd have been really looking forward to it, watching them do whatever it was, cheering on Cedric with everyone else, safe in his seat at the back of the stands. He wondered how the other champions were feeling. Every time he had seen Cedric lately, he had been surrounded by admirers and looking nervous but excited. Harry glimpsed Fleur Delacour from time to time in the corridors. She looked exactly as she always did, haughty and unruffled, and Crumb just sat in the library poring over books. Harry thought of Sirius, and the tight, tense knot in his chest seemed to ease slightly. He would be speaking to him in just over 12 hours, for tonight was the night they were meeting at the common room fire, assuming nothing went wrong, as everything else had done lately. Look, it's Hagrid, said Hermione. The back of Hagrid's enormous shaggy head, he had mercifully abandoned his bunches, emerged over the crowd. Harry wondered why he hadn't spotted him at once, as Hagrid was so large, but standing up carefully he saw that Hagrid had been leaning low, talking to Professor Moody. Hagrid had his usual enormous tankard in front of him, but Moody was drinking from his hip flask. Madame Rosmerta, the pretty landlady, didn't seem to think much of this. She was looking askance at Moody as she collected glasses from tables around them. Perhaps she thought it was an insult to her mulled mead, but Harry knew better. Moody had told them all during their last Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson that he preferred to prepare his own food and drink at all times, as it was so easy for dark wizards to poison an unattended cup. As Harry watched, he saw Hagrid and Moody get up to leave. He waved, then remembered that Hagrid couldn't see him. Moody, however, paused, his magical eye on the corner where Harry was standing. He tapped Hagrid in the small of the back, being unable to reach his shoulder, muttered something to him, and then the pair of them made their way back across the pub toward Harry and Hermione's table. "All right, Hermione," said Hagrid loudly. "Hello," said Hermione, smiling back. Moody limped around the table and bent down. Harry thought he was reading the SPEW notebook until he muttered, "Nice cloak, Potter." Harry stared at him in amazement. The large chunk missing from Moody's nose was particularly obvious at a few inches' distance. Moody grinned. Can you yet can see through invisibility cloaks," Moody said quietly, "and it's come in useful at times, I can tell you." Hagrid was beaming down at Harry, too. Harry knew Hagrid couldn't see him, but Moody had obviously told Hagrid he was there. Hagrid now bent down on the pretext of reading the SPEW notebook as well, and said in a whisper so low that only Harry could hear it, "Harry, meet me tonight at midnight at me cabin. Wear that cloak." Straightening up, Hagrid said loudly, "Nice to see ya, Hermione," winked, and departed. Moody followed him. "Why does Hagrid want to meet me at midnight?" Harry said, very surprised. "Does he?" said Hermione, looking startled. "I wondered what he was up to. I don't know whether you should go, Harry." She looked nervously around and hissed, "It might make you late for Sirius." It was true that going down to Hagrid's at midnight would mean cutting his meeting with Sirius very fine indeed. Hermione suggested sending Hedwig down to Hagrid's to tell him he couldn't go, always assuming she would consent to take the note, of course. Harry, however, thought it better just to be quick at whatever Hagrid wanted him for. He was very curious to know what this might be. Hagrid had never asked Harry to visit him so late at night. At 11:30 that evening, Harry, who had pretended to go up to bed early, pulled the invisibility cloak back over himself and crept downstairs through the common room. Quite a few people were still in there. The Creevy brothers had managed to get hold of a stack of Support Cedric Diggory badges and were trying to bewitch them to make them say Support Harry Potter instead, so on Potter stinks. Instead. So far, however, all they had managed to do was get the badges stuck on Potter stink. Sorry, I had missed a whole sentence there. Harry crept past them to the portrait hall and waited for a minute or so, keeping an eye on his watch. Then Hermione opened the fat lady for him from outside, as they had planned. He slipped past her with a whispered thanks and set off through the castle. The grounds was very dark. Harry walked down the lawn toward the lights shining in Hagrid's cabin. The inside of the enormous Beauxbaton carriage was also lit up. Harry could hear Madame Maxim talking inside it as he knocked on Hagrid's front door. "You there, Harry?" Hagrid whispered, opening the door and looking around. "Yes," said Harry, slipping inside the cabin and pulling the cloak down off his head. "What's up?" "Got something to show you," said Hagrid. There was an air of enormous excitement about Hagrid. He was wearing a flower that resembled an oversized artichoke in his buttonhole. It looked as though he had abandoned the use of axle grace, but he had certainly attempted to comb his hair. Harry could see the comb's broken teeth tangled in it. "What are you showing me?" Harry said wearily, wondering if the Scroots had laid eggs, or Hagrid had managed to buy another giant three-headed dog off a stranger in a pub. "Come with me, keep quiet, and keep yourself covered with that cloak," he said. "We won't take Fang. He won't like it." "Listen, Hagrid, I can't stay long. I've got to get back up to the castle by 1 o'clock. But Hagrid wasn't listening. He was opening the cabin door and striding off into the night. Harry hurried to follow and found, to his great surprise, that Hagrid was leading him to the Beauxbaton carriage. "Hagrid, what?" "Shh," said Hagrid, and he knocked 3 times on the door, bearing the crossed golden wands. Madame Maxim opened it. She was wearing a silk shawl wrapped around her massive shoulders. She smiled when she saw Hagrid. "Ah, Hagrid, it is time." "Bonsoir," said Hagrid, beaming at her and holding out a hand to help her down the golden steps. Madame Maxim closed the door behind him. Hagrid offered her his arm, and they set off around the edge of the paddock containing Madame Maxim's giant winged horses, with Harry, totally bewildered, running to keep up with them. Had Hagrid wanted to show him Madame Maxim, he could see her any old time he wanted. She wasn't exactly hard to miss. But it seemed that Madame Maxim was in for the same treat as Harry, because after a while she said pitifully, "Where is it you are taking me, Hagrid?" "You'll enjoy this," said Hagrid gruffly. "Worth seeing, trust me. Only don't go telling anyone I showed you, right? You're not supposed to know." "Of course not," said Madame Maxim, fluttering her long black eyelashes, and still they walked, Harry getting more and more irritated as he jogged along in their wake, checking his watch every now and then. Hagrid had some harebrained scheme in hand, which might make him miss Sirius. If they didn't get there soon, he was going to turn around, go straight back to the castle, and leave Hagrid to enjoy his moonlight stroll with Madame Maxim. But then, when they had walked so far around the perimeter of the forest that the castle and the lake were out of sight, Harry heard something. Men were shouting up ahead. Then came a deafening, ear-splitting roar. Hagrid led Madame Maxim around a clump of trees and came to a halt. Harry hurried up alongside them. For a split second, he thought he was seeing bonfires and men darting around them, and then his mouth fell open. Dragons. 4 fully grown, enormous, vicious-looking dragons were rearing into their hind legs inside an enclosure fenced with thick planks of wood, roaring and snorting. Torrents of fire were shooting into the dark sky from their open, fanged mouths. 50 feet above the ground, on their outstretched necks, there was a silvery blue one with long pointed horns, snapping and snarling at the wizards on the ground, a smooth scaled green one which was writhing and stamping with all its might, a red one with an odd fringe of fine gold spikes around its face, which was shooting mushroom-shaped fire clouds into the air, and a gigantic black one, more lizard-like than the others, which was nearest to them. At least 30 wizards, 7 or 8 to each dragon, were attempting to control them, pulling on the chains connected to heavy leather straps around their necks and legs. Mesmerized, Harry looked up, high above him, and saw the eyes of the black dragon, with vertical pupils like a cat's, bulging with either fear or rage, he couldn't tell which. It was making a horrible noise and yowling, screeching scream. "Keep back there, Hagrid," yelled a wizard near the fence, straining on the chain he was holding. "They can shoot fire at a range of 20 feet, you know. I've seen this horntail do 40. "Isn't it beautiful?" said Hagrid softly. "It's no good," yelled another wizard. "Stunning spells on the count of 3. Harry saw each of the dragon keepers pull out his wand. "Stupefy," they shouted in unison, and the stunning spells shot into the darkness like fiery rockets bursting in showers of stars on the dragon's scaly hides. Harry watched the dragon nearest to them teeter dangerously on its back legs, its jaws stretched wide in a silent howl. Its nostrils were suddenly devoid of flame, though still smoking. Then very slowly it fell. Several tons of sinewy, scaly black dragon hit the ground with a thud that Harry could have sworn made the trees behind him quake. The dragon keepers lowered their wands and walked forward to their fallen charges, each of which was the size of a small hill. They hurried to tighten the chains and fasten them securely to iron pegs, which they forced deep into the ground with their wands. "Want a closer look?" Hagrid asked Madame Maxim excitedly. The pair of them moved right up to the fence, and Harry followed. The wizard who had warned Hagrid not to come any closer turned, and Harry realized who it was, Charlie Weasley. "All right, Hagrid," he panted, coming over to talk. "They should be okay now. We put them out with a sleeping draught on the way here. Thought it might be better for them to wake up in the dark and the quiet. But, like you saw, they weren't happy. Not happy at all." "What breeds you got there, Charlie?" said Hagrid, gazing at the closest dragon, the black one, with something close to reverence. Its eyes were still just open. Harry could see a strip of gleaming yellow beneath its wrinkled black eyelid. "This is a Hungarian horntail," said Charlie. "There's a common Welsh green over there, the smaller one, a Swedish short snout, that blue-gray, and a Chinese fireball. That's the red." Harry looked around. Madame Maxim was strolling away around the edge of the enclosure, gazing at the stunned dragons. "I didn't know you were bringing her, Hagrid," Charlie said, frowning. "The champions aren't supposed to know what's coming. She's bound to tell her student, isn't she? Just thought she'd like to see 'em," shrugged Hagrid, still gazing enraptured at the dragons. "Really romantic date, Hagrid," said Charlie, shaking his head. "4," said Hagrid. "So it's one for each of the champions, is it? What have they got to do? Fight 'em?" "Just get past them, I think," said Charlie. "We'll be on hand if it gets nasty. Extinguishing spells at the ready. They wanted nesting mothers. I don't know why. But I tell you this, I don't envy the one who gets the horntail. Vicious thing. Its back end's as dangerous as its front. Look." Charlie pointed toward the horntail's tail, and Harry saw long, bronze-colored spikes protruding along it every few inches. 5 of Charlie's fellow keepers staggered up to the horntail at that moment, carrying a clutch of huge gray eggs between them and a blanket. They placed them carefully at the horntail's side. Hagrid let out a moan of longing. "I've got them counted, Hagrid," said Charlie sternly. Then he said, "How's Harry?" "Fine," said Hagrid. He was still gazing at the eggs. "Just hope he's still fine after he's faced this lot," said Charlie, grimly looking over the dragon's enclosure. "I didn't dare tell Mum what he's got to do for the first task. She's already having kittens about him." Charlie imitated his mother's anxious voice. "How could they let him enter that tournament? He's much too young. I thought they were all safe. I thought there was going to be an age limit." She was in floods after that Daily Prophet article about him. "He still cries about his parents. Oh, bless him, I never knew." Harry had had enough. Trusting to the fact that Hagrid wouldn't miss him, with the attractions of 4 dragons and Madame Maxim to occupy him, he turned silently and began to walk away, back to the castle. He didn't know whether he was glad he'd seen what was coming or not. Perhaps this way was better. The first shock was over now. Maybe if he'd seen the dragons for the first time on Tuesday, he would have passed out cold in front of the whole school. But maybe he would anyway. He was going to be armed with his wand, which, just now, felt like nothing more than a narrow strip of wood against a 50-foot-high scaly, spike-ridden, fire-breathing dragon, and he had to get past it, with everyone watching. How? Harry sped up, skirting the edge of the forest. He had just under 15 minutes to get back to the fireside and talk to Sirius, and he couldn't remember ever wanting to talk to someone more than he did right now, when, without warning, he ran into something very solid. Harry fell backward, his glasses askew, clutching the cloak around him. A voice nearby said, "Ouch! Who's there?" Harry hastily checked that the cloak was covering him and lay very still, staring up at the dark outline of the wizard he had hit. He recognized the goatee. It was Karkaroff. "Who's there?" said Karkaroff again, very suspiciously, looking around in the darkness. Harry remained still and silent. After a minute or so, Karkaroff seemed to decide that he had hit some sort of animal. He was looking around at waist height, as though expecting to see a dog. Then he crept back under the cover of the trees and started to edge forward toward the place where the dragons were. Very slowly and very carefully, Harry got to his feet and set off again as fast as he could without making too much noise, hurrying through the darkness back toward Hogwarts. He had no doubt whatsoever what Karkaroff was up to. He had sneaked off his ship to try and find out what the first test was going to be. He might even have spotted Hagrid and Madame Maxim heading off around the forest together. They were hardly difficult to spot at a distance, and now all Karkaroff had to do was follow the sound of voices, and he, like Madame Maxim, would know what was in store for the champions. By the looks of it, the only champion who would be facing the unknown on Tuesday was Cedric. Harry reached the castle, slipping in through the front doors, and began to climb the marble stairs. He was very out of breath, but he didn't dare slow down. He had less than 5 minutes to get up to the fire. "Balderdash," he gasped at the fat lady, who was snoozing in her frame in front of the portrait hole. "If you say so," she muttered sleepily, without opening her eyes, and the picture swung forward to admit him. Harry climbed inside. The common room was deserted, and judging by the fact that it smelled quite normal, Hermione had not needed to set off any dung bombs to ensure that he and Sirius got privacy. Harry pulled off the invisibility cloak and threw himself into an armchair in front of the fire. The room was in semi-darkness. The flames were the only source of light. Nearby on a table, to support Cedric Diggory badges, the Creevies had been trying to improve, were glittering in the firelight. They now read, "Potter really stinks." Harry looked back in the flames and jumped. Sirius's head was sitting in the fire. If Harry hadn't seen Mr. Diggory do exactly this back in the Weasleys' kitchen, it would have scared him out of his wits. Instead, his face breaking into the first smile he had worn for days, he scrambled out of his chair, crouched down by the hearth, and said, "Sirius, how are you doing?" Sirius looked different from Harry's memory of him. When they had said goodbye, Sirius's face had been gaunt and sunken, surrounded by a quantity of long, black, matted hair, but the hair was short and clean now. Sirius's face was fuller, and he looked younger, much more like the only photograph Harry had of him, which had been taken at the Potter's wedding. "Never mind me, how are you?" said Sirius seriously. For a second, Harry tried to say, "Fine," but he couldn't do it, because before he could stop himself, he was talking more than he'd talked in days, about how no one believed he hadn't entered the tournament of his own free will, how Rita Skeeter had lied about him in the Daily Prophet, how he couldn't walk down a corridor without being sneered at, and about Ron not believing him, Ron's jealousy, and now Hagrid's just showed me what's coming in the first task, and it's dragons, Sirius, and I'm a goner," he finished desperately. Sirius looked at him, eyes full of concern, eyes that had not yet lost the look that Azkaban had given them, that deadened, haunted look. He had let Harry talk himself into silence without interruption, but now he said, "Dragons we can deal with, Harry, but we'll get to that in a minute. I haven't got long here. I've broken into a wizarding house to use the fire, but they could be back any minute. Back any time. There are things I need to warn you about." "What?" said Harry, feeling his spirit slip a further few notches. "Surely there could be nothing worse than dragons coming." "Karkaroff," said Sirius. "Harry, he was a Death Eater. You know what Death Eaters are, don't you?" "Yes, What?" "He was caught. He was in Azkaban with me, but he got released. I'd bet everything that's why Dumbledore wanted an aura at Hogwarts this year, to keep an eye on him. Maybe he caught Karkaroff, put him into Azkaban in the first place." "Karkaroff got released?" Harry said slowly. His brain seemed to be struggling to absorb yet another piece of shocking information. "Why did they release him?" "He did a deal with the Ministry of Magic," said Sirius bitterly. "He said he'd seen the error of his ways, and then he named names. He put a load of other people into Azkaban in his place. He's not very popular in there, I can tell you, and since he got out, from what I can tell, he's been teaching the dark arts to every student who passes through that school of his, so watch out for the Durmstrang champion as well." "Okay," said Harry slowly, "but are you saying Karkaroff put my name in the goblet? Because if he did, he's a really good actor. He seemed furious about it. He wanted to stop me from competing." "We know he's a good actor," said Sirius, "because he's convinced the Ministry of Magic to set him free, didn't he? Now, I've been keeping an eye on the Daily Prophet, Harry." "You and the rest of the world," said Harry bitterly, and reading between the lines of that Skeeter woman's article last month, Moody was attacked the night before he started at Hogwarts. "Yes, I know she says it was another false alarm," Sirius said hastily. seeing Harry about to speak, but I don't think so somehow. I think someone tried to stop him from getting to Hogwarts. I think someone knew their job would be a lot more difficult with him around, and no one's going to look into it too closely. Mad Eye's heard intruders a bit too often, but that doesn't mean he can't still spot the real thing. Moody was the best Auror the Ministry ever had. So what are you saying? Said Harry slowly. Karkaroff's trying to kill me. But why? Sirius hesitated. I've been hearing some very strange things, he said slowly. The Death Eaters seem to be a bit more active than usual lately. They showed themselves at the Quidditch World Cup, didn't they? Someone set off the Dark Mark. And then, did you hear about the Ministry of Magic witch who's gone missing? Bertha Jorkins, said Harry. Exactly. She disappeared in Albania, and that's definitely where Voldemort was rumored to be last. And she would have known the Triwizard Tournament was coming up, wouldn't she? Yeah, but it's not very likely she'd have walked straight into Voldemort, is it? Said Harry. Listen, I knew Bertha Jorkins, said Sirius grimly. She was at Hogwarts when I was, a few years before your dad and me. And she was an idiot. Very nosy, but no brains. None at all. It's not a good combination, Harry. I'd say she'd be very easy to lure into a trap. So Voldemort could have found out about the tournament, said Harry. Is that what you mean? You think Karkaroff might be here on his orders? I don't know, said Sirius slowly. I just don't know. Karkaroff doesn't strike me as a type who'd go back to Voldemort unless he knew Voldemort was powerful enough to protect him. But whoever put your name in that goblet did it for a reason, and I can't help thinking the tournament would be a very good way to attack you and make it look like an accident. Looks like a really good plan from where I'm standing, said Harry, grinning bleakly. They'll just have to stand back and let the dragons do their stuff. Right, these dragons, said Sirius, speaking very quickly now. There's a way, Harry. Don't be tempted to try a stunning spell. Dragons are strong and too powerfully magical to be knocked out by a single stunner. You need about a half-dozen wizards at a time to overcome a dragon. Yeah, I know, I just saw, said Harry. But you can do it alone, said Sirius. There is a way, and a simple spell's all you need. But Harry held up a hand to silence him, his heart suddenly pounding as though it would burst. He could hear footsteps coming down the spiral staircase behind him. Go, he hissed at Sirius. Go, there's someone coming. Harry scrambled to his feet, hiding the fire. If someone saw Sirius's face within the walls of Hogwarts, they would raise an almighty uproar. The Ministry would get dragged in. Harry, would be questioned about Sirius's whereabouts. Harry heard a tiny pop in the fire behind him and knew Sirius had gone. He watched the bottom of the spiral staircase, who had decided to go for a stroll at 1 o'clock in the morning, and stopped Sirius from telling him how to get past the dragon. It was Ron. Dressed in his maroon paisley pajamas, Ron stopped dead, facing Harry across the room, and looked around. Who were you talking to? He said. What's that got to do with you? Harry snarled. What are you doing down here at this time of night? I just wondered where you... Ron broke off, shrugging. Nothing. I'm going back to bed. Just thought you'd come nosing around, did you? Harry shouted. He knew that Ron had no idea what he'd walked in on. Knew he hadn't done it on purpose, but he didn't care. At this moment, he hated everything about Ron, right down to the several inches of bare ankle showing beneath his pajama trousers. Sorry about that, said Ron, his face reddening with anger. Should have realized you didn't want to be disturbed. I'll let you get on with practicing for your next interview in peace. Harry seized one of the Potter really stinks badges off the table and chucked it as hard as he could across the room. It hit Ron in the forehead and bounced off. There you go, Harry said. Something for you to wear on Tuesday. You might even have a scar now if you're lucky. That's what you want, isn't it? He strode across the room toward the stairs. He half expected Ron to stop him. He would even have liked Ron to throw a punch at him, but Ron just stood there in his two small pajamas, and Harry, having stormed upstairs, lay awake in bed, fuming for a long time afterward. Didn't hear him come up to bed. Well, Ron and Harry seem to really have a bout going on, that's for sure. They don't seem to really be enjoying each other's company. It seems that Ron really pressed the buttons on that one. Let's see, I want to see how many chapters we have left. We have about 17 chapters left in this book, because we are leaving off on chapter 20, and there are 37 chapters, so we have 17 chapters left. Alright, but anyways, that's going to be it for today. Let me know what you guys think, what your thoughts are about what's happening, and what you think about the bout going on with Ron and Harry. I know it's a lot to think about. Ron and Harry, they never really fight. They never really argue. They both come from Harry comes from a tattered home and no parents, and Ron kind of comes from a home where he's overlooked because of having so many siblings, so he kind of feels in the same boat as Harry, just not exactly like Harry. But, it's kind of the two best friends, and Harry can't really rely on him because Ron doesn't believe what Harry has to say. And it's kind of upsetting for Harry because it's supposed to be his best friend, and then I think part of the problem too is they both just keep going neck and neck at each other because of pent up anger or rage or whatever it is, and neither one of them wants to really apologize, so they're just kind of waiting for the other to step forward and say something first, and I don't really think that's going to happen, but we shall see as we go forward on with the story. But thank you guys for listening. If you guys enjoy, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I will catch everybody in the next video. I hope y'all have a fantastic rest of your night, morning, or evening whenever you're listening to this. And I will catch everybody in the next read along. Much love, guys. Bye.